Flames licked at the sky from a village nestled deep within a valley, surrounded on all sides by the sharp, imposing peaks of pointed mountains. Tiny houses were being consumed by the fire, their walls crumbling inwards. From within the inferno, desperate shouts arose. People were yelling for the attackers to stop their destruction, their voices raw with fear and anger. They cried out against the encroaching Murim Alliance, a vast force that had descended upon the region and reached the gates of the primordial demon pavilion. Further shouts echoed through the air, a desperate plea to keep the invaders from breaching the pavilion's defenses at any cost. Inside the pavilion grounds, a scene of chaos unfolded. Many people were running with frantic energy, all of them heading towards the rising fires where the fighting was fiercest. Yet, amidst this panicked rush, a single figure moved in the opposite direction, pushing against the tide towards a grand building. This was no small skirmish. The primordial demon pavilion was under assault by the combined might of the Orthodox and unorthodox Murim Alliance, a force numbering well over 10,000 warriors who swarmed the grounds like countless determined ants. As the solitary figure ran towards a particular structure, an old man watching the scene unfolded called out his title, recognizing him as the inner administrator. The old man, his face etched with concern, stated that the administrator still had not made his escape from the dangerous situation. The protagonist paused his urgent movement, looking at the old man who had spoken, and acknowledged him, addressing him as Captain Sandojian. Captain Sandojian approached the administrator, his brow furrowed with worry. He questioned why Jin Yeomyung, the inner administrator, had no guards accompanying him in such a perilous place. The captain insisted that the area was far too dangerous and urged Jin Yeomyung to come away with him immediately. Jin Yeomyung explained that he had been on his way to retrieve the cult leader. In another part of the pavilion, a woman of striking beauty sat upon a chair, seemingly unmoving amidst the chaos. Captain Sandojian elaborated on her state, explaining that despite instructing all the followers to abandon the main mountain for safety, she herself had not stirred from her position. Jin Yeomyung placed a hand on the captain's shoulder, a gesture of weary reassurance. He stated with a somber tone that at this rate, their defense lines would inevitably collapse in less than an hour. He instructed the captain to prioritize his own safety and get away quickly. With a voice heavy with concern, Jin Yeomyung told the captain that after he understood the cult leader's intentions, he would then retreat with her. However, as the captain turned and ran back towards the raging inferno, Jin Yeomyung knew deep down that it was already too late for such plans. He let out a long, heavy sigh as he stood alone, contemplating his dire circumstances. Internally, he expressed his frustration, feeling that this time around, his efforts seemed destined to be a complete failure. He then turned and resumed his run, heading towards the large building directly ahead of him. A grand door stood before him, and above it, a plaque bore the inscription, Heaven Demonic Pavilion. Standing outside the imposing door, Jin Yeomyung called out, announcing himself as Jin Yeomyung, the inner administrator, and addressing the cult leader within. Receiving no immediate response, his tone grew frustrated, and he called out again, repeating his name and title more forcefully. Still, the silence from inside persisted. A third time, his anger flared even higher, and he shouted at the top of his lungs, calling out to the cult leader. At that moment, a soft, gentle voice drifted from within the palace, asking Jin Yeomyung to come inside. Hearing this unexpected reply, Jin Yeomyung was startled. He instinctively placed a hand over his mouth, his mind racing with surprise. He had genuinely not anticipated any response at all. With trembling hands, he reached for the heavy door, attempting to push it open. A thought flickered through his mind, wondering if she had perhaps heard him speaking in a casual manner earlier. He put all his strength into pushing the door, but refused to budge. As he strained against the unyielding wood, he continued to think, hoping she would understand his earlier informal address, since he had not begun speaking that way from the outset. He kept trying to open the door, pushing with all his might until exhaustion set in, his entire body beginning to tremble from the effort. After what felt like an eternity of struggle, the massive door slowly yielded, opening with a soft, creaking sound. Jin Yeomyung let out another long sigh of weariness. He muttered a curse at the door, complaining that whoever had opened it should have at least stayed there to help. He grumbled to himself that the situation felt incredibly heavy, a burden weighing down on him. Sweat poured down his face, beads dripping from his mouth and onto the floor, clear evidence of his utter exhaustion. With one final surge of energy, he gave the door a big push, sending it swinging open fully, and he stumbled inside the palace, huffing from the exertion. Across the large ground floor room, on the other side, sat the beautiful woman from before. Her dark hair flowed around her, framing soft pink lips, and sweat also glistened on her face. The woman spoke to Jin Yeomyung, observing that his martial arts skills were still worse than even a third-rate practitioner. Jin Yeomyung made his way towards where she sat, and upon reaching her, he voiced his frustration. He complained that while he was struggling with the heavy door, she had been simply watching and seemed to be enjoying his predicament. He added, perhaps more to himself than to her, that he was fortunate none of the other elders or captains had witnessed his struggle. The woman simply replied that indeed she had been watching, and furthermore, if any elder had seen him speaking to her so casually, as if he were completely at ease, he would undoubtedly be facing significant trouble. Hearing this confirmation, Jin Yeomyung groaned loudly, the realization sinking in that she had heard everything he had muttered. While this thought echoed in his mind, he began to climb the stairs leading up to the pavilion where the woman was located. Reaching the top, he knelt down on one leg, offering a formal greeting to the cult leader. The woman seated upon the long, black throne was none other than the 29th Heavenly Demonic Cult Leader, the Grand Master of the demonic faction, Cheon Yura, also known as the Heartless Demonic Empress. Cheon Yura gazed down at the kneeling Jin Yeomyung and spoke, calling him the weakest of all the inner administrators. She questioned why he had come seeking her out at this critical moment. With a face etched with concern, Jin Yeomyung looked up at Cheon Yura and asked why she was still there, exposed to the danger. Cheon Yura, her voice soft and strained, struggled to form her words. She spoke of the heaven-destroying poison, a terrible substance. She explained that it was a poison causing massacre and blood loss, a formless poison that melted bone, an affliction that crippled completely. Listening to her words, Jin Yeomyung clenched his fist and struck the floor in frustration. He exclaimed, demanding that she not tell him that he, referring to Han Yubik, had been given this poison. Jin Yeomyung gritted his teeth, stating that the poison had been administered to Cheon Yura by that detestable person, the demonic faction lord. The demonic faction lord was named Han Yubik, the man whom the cult leader herself had chosen as her husband. Han Yubik was also the very individual who had thrown open the gates of the 10,000 mountains, allowing the orthodox and unorthodox Murim Alliance to pour inside. He was, in essence, the leader of the traitors. Cheon Yura commented to Jin Yeomyung that Han Yubik had spoken these words to her before he left. He claimed that he had gone through an incredibly difficult time just to be able to approach her. As Cheon Yura recalled this conversation with the traitor, she lowered her head, her eyes partially closed, and sweat continued to pour profusely from her face. She continued her recollection, stating that Han Yubik had put in immense effort to win over the hearts of the former cult leaders and her own. The reason he had poisoned her, he claimed, was so that she might understand just a small part of the suffering he had endured. Listening to Cheon Yura recount the traitor's words and his twisted rationale for poisoning her, Jin Yeomyung was left awestruck and utterly disgusted by the actions of the heavenly demonic lord. He muttered, calling him a truly crazy person. Cheon Yura, regaining some semblance of her composure, looked at Jin Yeomyung and told him that he was indeed an interesting man. Jin Yeomyung looked up at her with a confused expression, telling Cheon Yura that this was hardly the time for such observations. He thought to himself, and perhaps said aloud, that she had always appeared so serious and confident, someone who was consistently stern and unyielding. Yet, in these final moments, she was actually laughing. Still kneeling, Jin Yeomyung asked Cheon Yura if it was truly too late for her. Cheon Yura speculated, her body struggling under the poison's effects, that the heaven-destroying poison had most likely already taken over her energy core. It was visible, her once bright energy core now surrounded by the dark, ominous flames of the demonic poison. Cheon Yura further stated that while she might have been able to contend with other types of poisons, this particular one was beyond her ability to handle. Hearing this, Jin Yeomyung felt a profound sadness wash over him. Leaning forward on the floor, he tilted his head down, gazing at the ground, and asked the cult leader, what if? He trailed off, unable to complete the question, then simply added, just, what if? Cheon Yura, surprised and perhaps a little shocked by his hesitant but persistent questioning, replied simply, yes. Jin Yeomyung, feeling slightly less anxious and more at ease despite the circumstances, laughed softly and said, yes, that's right. Didn't we talk about this in the past? He then recounted something he had once said to her, that he had saved his world in a past life. Cheon Yura, leaning back on her throne, remarked that it was difficult to believe someone like him could have possibly saved an entire world. However, she added, giving Jin Yeomyung the benefit of the doubt, let's say it is true. She then questioned his motive, asking why he was trying to plant hope in her. If such an opportunity for reincarnation existed, she reasoned, he should be fully occupied with his own affairs. Hearing the unexpectedly gentle response from Cheon Yura, Jin Yeomyung placed one hand over his chest as if bowing slightly. He explained that, firstly, he was someone who could not tolerate being betrayed. He added, secondly, that this was also his way of repaying the help he had received from her. Hearing what Jin Yeomyung had just said, Cheon Yura was taken aback, a flicker of pleasant surprise in her eyes. She questioned softly, seemingly to herself, my help? At this point, Jin Yeomyung looked up at Cheon Yura, telling her that there was no need to dwell on it. He recalled their earlier encounter, explaining that he had simply been presented as one of the candidates for her political marriage. He added that this was probably what she thought had happened between them. Cheon Yura offered a soft smile, her eyes drifting to look away from Jin Yeomyung as she questioned again. Reincarnation? Jin Yeomyung, a soft smile and a hopeful glint in his eyes, asked Cheon Yura once more, if I truly reincarnate, as you said, what would you do? He continued, explaining that even if she reincarnated, she would not remember what was happening now. Despite that, he had resolved his heart. The traitors of their cult, all the despicable members of the orthodox Murim Alliance who had invaded the 10,000 mountains, and the shadowy third-party group that had orchestrated the entire incident. He declared with an angry expression in his eyes that he would use his very soul to slaughter them all. Jin Yeomyung reiterated his question to Cheon Yura, his voice pleading. He asked her to please tell him if there was something she truly desired, promising that he, who would remember this day, would do his utmost to fulfill it. Cheon Yura shifted her position on the throne, placing one leg over the other and resting a hand against her chin. She leaned forward, and with a slightly teasing tone, she cheekily asked Jin Yeomyung if he would mind seducing her. Hearing this unexpected request, Jin Yeomyung was left utterly dumbfounded. His eyes widened in surprise as he questioned if he had truly heard correctly. He added that while he felt confident he could prevent Han Mubik from becoming the demonic faction lord in a new life, he was not at all confident about becoming her romantic partner. Hearing Jin Yeomyung's candid response, Cheon Yura's expression turned angry. She stated that she knew he hated her. Jin Yeomyung added honestly that she must surely know such a thing was close to being impossible. He further explained that a romantic relationship required both parties to be willing. And to be frank, when she had been the young cult leader, she was simply a tyrant whom no one could stop. In the background, a bizarre sight could be seen. Fallen figures on the floor with their souls comically rising upwards, a visual representation of the chaotic power dynamics. Jin Yeomyung added that she had crushed every single man who had dared to approach her, not only rejecting them, but seemingly breaking their spirits. This, he suggested, was one of the reasons Han Mubik had ultimately become the demonic faction lord. He was the only one who could tolerate her formidable temper. Cheon Yura, feeling a touch of sadness at Jin Yeomyung's blunt words, said quietly that he did not have to do it if he truly did not wish to. With that, she turned her face away from him. She murmured softly to herself, almost inaudibly, who said it was impossible. At this point, Jin Yeomyung rose from his kneeling position and began to slowly climb the stairs leading towards her throne. As he ascended, he thought to himself, and perhaps muttered under his breath, that a romantic relationship certainly begins with someone who is interested. Cheon watched him as he climbed, lifting her head to look at the approaching Jin Yeomyung. She leaned down slightly and added to his thought, suggesting it could also begin with someone who is not interested. Cheon Yura was surprised by Jin Yeomyung's actions and words, taken aback by the unexpected shift in his demeanor. Shock cleared her eyes. With a gentle smile gracing his face, Jin Yeomyung declared that for her, Lady Cheon Yura, achieving such a feat was not at all difficult. Hearing his words, Cheon Yura was pleasantly surprised. She commented that it seemed a long time had passed since she was in her 30s. She lowered her head, covering her mouth with her hands, and confessed that his comment was a little embarrassing. Meanwhile, Jin Yeomyung was thinking something quite different. Looking at the emotion she was displaying, he thought to himself that she was incredibly beautiful. His gaze narrowed slightly as he looked towards Cheon Yura and spoke again, asking her to promise him one important thing. Holding onto a part of Cheon Yura's dress, Jin Yeomyung asked her to forgive him if he spoke harshly about her past self. He added that if she possessed any weaknesses, he would greatly appreciate learning about them. Cheon Yura met Jin Yeomyung's gaze and continued to stare at him, a steady, unwavering look that made Jin Yeomyung feel quite flustered. Cheon Yura then stated that if their conversation were ever to be revealed, she would kill Jin Yeomyung with everything she had. She reminded him that she was only saying this once, so he needed to listen very carefully and ensure he never disclosed any part of their discussion. Her tone was stern and held a clear threat. Jin Yeomyung shivered slightly at the intensity he saw in Cheon Yura. He stumbled over his words, managing to say okay, along with other jumbled sounds. Still kneeling, his body trembling slightly, he remarked shakily that she had indeed been quite formidable back in the day. Cheon Yura retorted sharply, telling him to be silent. However, she was also visibly embarrassed, moving her gaze away from him. In a softer tone, she then stated that it seemed their conversation had reached its end. A feeling arose that other people were about to enter the palace room. Without further delay, a group of individuals gathered and entered through the same large door Jin Yeomyung had struggled with just moments before. Cheon Yura looked up as they entered, and Jin Yeomyung observed that the intruders had managed to make it this far. Cheon Yura then made a grim joke to Jin Yeomyung, saying that she could allow him to die peacefully if he wished. Jin Yeomyung, in turn, jokingly declined the offer. With a confident, slightly smug voice, he declared that if it was possible, he wanted to witness everything until the very end, his gaze fixed on Cheon Yura. Simultaneously, the leader of the Orthodox and unorthodox Murim Alliance, the supreme figure named Gwanhyun, looked upon both Cheon Yura and Jin Yeomyung. He spoke, expressing his thought that he had lived long enough to witness the fall of the demon cult during his generation. Gwanhyun further stated that it was an honor for him to be able to witness the downfall of the demonic cult firsthand. Hearing these words, Jin Yeomyung's anger flared once more. He shouted out towards the group, asking if they even knew who they were keeping at their side, clearly referring to Han Mubik. Gwanhyun replied confidently, a wide grin splitting his face and his eyes sharp as he pointed toward Han Mubik. He identified him as the so-called heavenly divine dragon, the one who had endured disgrace for the sake of the martial world, the Jianghu. Jin Yeomyung let out a surprised but quirky laugh, mocking the title. He ridiculed Han Mubik for walking among the orthodox factions bearing such a grand title. Han Mubik, pointing his sword directly at Cheon Yura, shouted out, addressing her as the heartless demonic empress, the grandmaster of the demonic faction. He declared that it was time for her to pay for her sins. Looking at the scene playing out before her, Cheon Yura could not entirely hide her surprise, but she responded with a touch of dark humor. She spoke mockingly, saying, "Oh, my beloved husband has returned." With a look of disgust on his face, Han Mubik responded to Cheon Yura, stating that everything he had done was for the sake of the Jianghu. Cheon Yura's expression turned serious, sweat still pouring down her face, her eyes sharp and piercing. She corrected Han Mubik, stating emphatically that it was all for the sake of the heaven-defying society. Was it not? Hearing this, the gathered people began to murmur amongst themselves, questioning the name Heaven-Defying Society. They had never even heard of it, and a ripple of confusion spread as everyone began asking what that even was. Even Jin Yeomyung was surprised by Cheon Yura's exclamation, and he thought to himself, the Heaven-Defying Society? Seeing the confusion among the gathered individuals, Han Mubik pointed his sword towards Cheon Yura and shouted at the alliance leaders and everyone present not to be fooled by the words of this witch. He claimed she was merely trying to create discord among them in her final moments. The gathered people, hearing Han Mubik's assertion, drew their swords. They took up fighting positions, pointing their blades towards Jin Yeomyung and Cheon Yura, preparing for the imminent battle. The leader, Gwon Hyun, stated that Han Yubik was correct and that the words of a demon held no weight. Another person in the group added that the cult leader's life was already hanging by a thread. There was no need to engage her in a one-on-one duel. They urged everyone to attack with full force. Hearing these declarations, Cheon Yura and Jin Yeomyung also prepared themselves, drawing their swords. With a confident stance despite her condition, Cheon Yura stated that even though she was poisoned, she could still handle the likes of them on her own. Gwon Hyun, a wild smile on his face, remarked that Cheon Yura certainly spoke with great confidence for a cult leader facing her end. At that moment, Cheon Yura released her aura, a dark red energy swirling outwards from her. Proclaiming the name of the heaven-slaying demon sword art, countless swords materialized around her, all gleaming with malevolent energy. Looking upon this terrifying sight, the people who had gathered to fight against Cheon Yura and Jin Yeomyung were stunned into surprise. Some even acknowledged the imminent danger, muttering that she still possessed such immense strength left within her. Gwon Hyun, undeterred, proclaimed and shouted out the name of his squad, the Golden Dragon Heavenly Sword Squad, and then gave the order to attack. With the sound of a unified cry for the assault, all the people who had gathered charged towards Cheon Yura and Jin Yeomyung, who were now surrounded by a swirling cloud of red and black swords. The scene then shifted. We saw Cheon Yura with blood smeared on her face, her eyes barely able to remain open. She spoke to Jin Yeomyung, asking him with a touch of dark humor if he was still alive. Jin Yeomyung, also covered in blood, looked at the cult leader, who was now impaled by countless swords. Cheon Yura, with her fading strength, offered a final thought, expressing gratitude that she was able to say goodbye to Jin Yeomyung before she met her end. Jin Yeomyung spoke, his voice heavy with sorrow, stating that the attackers had now retreated. Cheon Yura explained weakly that those who had come to attack them had run away from the heavenly demon Hull once he had activated the self-destruction array. Jin Yeomyung, not fully registering Cheon Yura's words, was consumed by worry for her state. With a concerned expression and wide, distressed eyes, he shouted out her title, Cult Leader. At this point, the fire was raging violently throughout the hall. Cheon Yura looked at Jin Yeomyung, asking him why he was crying. Unable to bear the sight of Cheon Yura in her current condition, Jin Yeomyung looked up, his hair matted with blood obscuring his eyes. He cried openly, stating simply that it was because he was sad. Cheon Yura extended her hand, now dripping with blood, and gently grasped Jin Yeomyung by the chin. She spoke his name, Jin Yeomyung, and then asked him again, her voice faint but firm, if he would indeed seduce her. Unable to maintain her composure any longer, Cheon Yura retreated her hand back. Jin Yeomyung, gritting his teeth against his sorrow, sadly sighed and replied, "Yes." Cheon Yura could no longer keep her eyes open. As they slowly closed, she gave Jin Yeomyung a brilliant final smile. She whispered that it was good to know he would keep his promise to her. With that, Cheon Yura fell backward from the throne. Jin Yeomyung hurriedly scrambled to his feet, attempting to support her, but she slipped away, falling down from the pavilion structure and into the raging fire below. Jin Yeomyung, his face streaked with tears, shouted that these were the final moments of his life. He lunged forward, grabbing hold of Cheon Yura as he too plunged into the destructive flames. The scene shifted again, now to a high cliff face. A solitary figure stood on a rocky outcropping, surrounded by a throng of people with their hands raised in celebration. The people were shouting praises towards the hero who had saved humanity, the guardian of Earth. Thanks to his heroic deeds, the gods had granted him 3 special advantages and had promised him 2 more chances to be reborn into a new life. Originally, the hero had planned to live his next life pursuing wild fun and enjoyment without restraint. However, the memory of Cheon Yura's brilliant smile and her final words to him, asking if he would seduce her, came flooding back. The hero, Jin Yeomyung, closed his eyes for a moment. He resolved that in this final life, he would dedicate everything he had to Cheon Yura. With that firm decision made, Jin Yeomyung opened his eyes. Suddenly, a confusing sensation, like a burst of cold water, jolted him. As his senses returned, he saw a bald man with a wide grin on his face shouting excitedly at him, calling him young master, and proclaiming that he was finally awake. Jin Yeomyung, surprised, called out the servant's name, Gu Cheol. Gu Cheol confirmed his identity, stating that it was indeed correct and that he was Jin Yeomyung's loyal servant. Jin Yeomyung thought to himself, observing the servant's youthful appearance, that judging by his face, he had definitely regressed quite far into the past. Jin Yeomyung was in a state of shock, drenched because of the water Gu Cheol had splashed on him. He questioned the servant about the reason for such an abrupt wash fashion, asking why he couldn't have simply woken him by shaking him gently. Gu Cheol replied to Jin Yeomyung, who was now seated in a chair before a dining table laden with a variety of meat dishes and scattered drinks. Gu Cheol explained that Jin Yeomyung himself had given the order to splash him with water if he happened to fall asleep. Jin Yeomyung felt a mixture of confusion and fear as he now realized the precise point in time he had regressed to, the moment he was about to be severely beaten by his father, the patriarch. This was when Jin Yeomyung was just 7 years old, a time when he had first arrived at the demonic heaven tower, harboring dreams of becoming the demonic cult's most notorious playboy. His father, the patriarch Azura, King Jin Gunake of the demonic heaven's Jin clan, stood holding a jar of drink. He shouted at Jin Yeomyung, accusing him of sneaking into the upper floors and drinking alcohol before his coming-of-age ceremony. Jin Yeomyung vividly recalled that the last time this had happened in his previous life, he had been beaten mercilessly, like a dog, and dragged home by his father. Jin Gunake, holding the bottle by its neck, declared that the eldest son of the Jin clan had been knocked out by a single bottle of alcohol and at a party attended by heirs from other prominent families, no less. He roared at Jin Yeomyung, calling him pathetic. Realizing his father was consumed by anger, his head seemingly bursting with fiery rage, Jin Yeomyung hurriedly ran towards him. As he moved, the chair he had been sitting on threatened to fall backward, but Gu Cheol quickly caught it with his leg. Jin Yeomyung reached his father and attempted to explain the situation, but Jin Gunake cut him off swiftly, shouting at him to remain silent. Jin Yeomyung immediately knelt down before his father and responded, "Yes, sir." Jin Gunake expressed his disbelief that his son could be so weak. He stated further that if Jin Yeomyung was destined to be weak, he had better at least possess intelligence. With sharp, wide-open eyes fixed on Jin Yeomyung, Jin Gunake asked if he understood why he had come personally to drag him back home. Jin Yeomyung remembered that in his previous life, he had been beaten even worse because he failed to answer this very question. But this time, confident that things would be different and determined to make them so, he answered his father's query. He stated that it must be because his engagement meeting with the young cult leader had been confirmed. Jin Yeomyung's mind raced, recalling the details of that critical time. There had been many potential suitors, all vying for Cheon Yura's favor. The engagement meeting involved Cheon Yura, then a 17-year-old young cult leader, meeting with the elite heirs of the 6 great clans. This period was immensely important because a contest was being held to determine the young cult leader's future spouse. Jin Yeomyung remembered that during that past event, no one had been chosen. Because no match was made, the demonic faction lord selection tournament had proceeded, and the traitor Han Mubik had won the tournament, subsequently marrying Cheon Yura. Jin Yeomyung, still kneeling and dripping wet, promised himself internally that in this life, his final chance, that outcome would not happen again. Looking down at Jin Yeomyung, Jin Gunake stated that the only reason Jin Yeomyung, a man lacking talent and motivation, had been allowed to live until this moment was for this very purpose. It was widely known that Jin Gunake was a ruthless father, willing to use even his own son for the glory of their clan. With a stern expression in his eyes, Jin Gunake questioned Jin Yeomyung, "Can you win her heart and rise above the other heirs?" Jin Yeomyung looked up at his father, a confident grin spreading across his face. He replied that the other heirs of the 6 great clans would never succeed in winning her over. Satisfied by Jin Yeomyung's answer, Jin Gunake's wide grin widened further. He said simply, "Good." He then instructed Jin Yeomyung that if he didn't want to bring disgrace upon their name, he should at least focus on improving his self-defense martial arts. The scene then shifted to outside the pavilion, where Jin Gunake was walking away. Inside, Jin Yeomyung was thinking to himself, feeling a pang of bad luck at having run into his father the very moment he had woken up in the past. Looking down from the pavilion floors, Jin Yeomyung reflected that even so, This reincarnation was the best possible outcome he could have hoped for. Not only had he been granted 10 years, but he had found himself 17 years in the past in total, providing him with plenty of opportunities to change the course of events. Jin Yeomyung recalled the last words Cheon Yura had spoken in their previous life before their tragic end. She had mentioned that everything Han Mubik had done was for the heaven-defying society. Jin Yeomyung thought to himself that the heaven-defying society was likely active during this earlier time period as well. With an angry expression settling on his face, he looked down and declared internally that in this life, he would wipe them out completely, roots and all. Feeling scared by Jin Yeomyung's intense expression and the murmur he had just heard, Gu Cheol nervously asked, "Young master, what are you planning to do?" Jin Yeomyung, unaware that Gu Cheol had been standing behind him and had overheard his low mutterings about wiping out the heaven-defying society, nonchalantly turned around and simply asked, "What?" Gu Cheol countered Jin Yeomyung's question by asking what he meant by what. Gu Cheol reminded him that he had just boldly declared his intention to become the young cult leader's future spouse. Jin Yeomyung placed one hand to his face, thinking hard for a moment. With a surprised expression, he then asked Gu Cheol when he said that. Gu Cheol felt a wave of surprise at the words Jin Yeomyung had just spoken. He started to question them, beginning to say, "Wait, but just now." However, before he could finish his thought, Jin Yeomyung, looking at Gu Cheol, clarified his earlier statement. He explained that he had never actually said he would become the young cult leader's husband. Jin Yeomyung continued, his expression somewhat lost and unchallenged, that his remark had only meant that the other young man would certainly be rejected by her. Upon hearing this, Gu Cheol's face twisted into a look of deep confusion. His eyes widened, one eyebrow shot high up his forehead, while the other remained completely flat, like a calm, still sea. He scratched his cheek and suggested that what Jin Yeomyung described sounded essentially like the same thing. Jin Yeomyung, however, insisted that they were very different. Thinking back to moments from his past, Jin Yeomyung quietly stated that in this life, Cheon Yura could not be won over, no matter the circumstances. A sad and somewhat pained look crossed his face. He closed his eyes for a moment and mumbled to himself that Cheon Yura was focused entirely on achieving perfection in her martial arts, leaving her no time to be swayed by potential suitors, even heirs from the important Six Kingdoms. Jin Yeomyung went on to reflect that, knowing Cheon Yura's true nature, she likely would not even spare a glance for anyone weaker than herself, and he believed he would probably fall into that category. As Jin Yeomyung and Gu Cheol continued their quiet conversation, a sudden voice cut through the air from behind them. A new figure, dressed in a striking red outfit and carrying a sword, announced loudly that their presence was unexpected and they were still there. Jin Yeomyung turned, trying to place the identity of this person. The newcomer was entirely covered in red. His clothes, his hair, his eyes, even the handle of his sword was red. This person was Ma Cholsu, known as the second son of the Blood Dragon demonic clan. Ma Cholsu's expression was one of anger, his naturally red eyes appearing even more bloodshot. He shouted at Jin Yeomyung, demanding to know if he had seen a ghost or something, reacting to Jin Yeomyung's attempt to recall him. Jin Yeomyung, displaying an unusually cheerful look in response to Ma Cholsu's aggression, calmly replied that it wasn't exactly that, and then inquired about the whereabouts of Younghee. Hearing Jin Yeomyung ask about Younghee, Ma Cholsu lost control of his emotions. He closed his eyes tightly and let out a furious yell at the top of his voice, declaring that he did not have a younger sister by that name, and questioning why Jin Yeomyung always said such nonsensical things whenever they met. He then challenged Jin Yeomyung to a duel right there. Jin Yeomyung was visibly confused by this unexpected challenge. With a puzzled expression, he murmured that the request had come completely out of nowhere. He remembered that this specific event, this particular confrontation, had not happened in his previous life. He began to ponder why things were different now, thinking perhaps it was because in this current life, his father had not beaten him up and dragged him back home, suggesting that since the past had changed, unpredictable events were now occurring. The six demonic clans were powerful houses that ruled alongside the heavenly demonic cult and the Cheon clan. These included the Pei clan, the Sa clan, the So clan, the Huan clan, the Jin clan, and finally, the Ma clan. Among these six, the Jin clan and the Ma clan had always held a deep-seated rivalry, constantly seeking to overcome each other. While personal conflicts between members of different clans were technically not allowed, Ma Cholsu pointed out that there was always a specific clause that allowed for exceptions. Holding his right hand out while keeping his left hand clasped behind his back, Ma Cholsu indicated this exception. Jin Yeomyung, moving slightly forward with a gentle step, inquired about this exemption clause. He reasoned that since the situation did not threaten the survival of either clan and was not an official, formal duel, it must concern a matter involving the Cheon clan. He then directly asked Ma Cholsu if this challenge was related to the young cult leader. Ma Cholsu made no attempt to hide the truth. He openly accepted the premise, boldly challenging Jin Yeomyung of the Jin clan. He stated clearly that if Jin Yeomyung lost this duel to him, then Jin Yeomyung should withdraw from participating in the upcoming engagement meeting with the young cult leader. Jin Yeomyung, however, allowed himself a slight, gentle smile inwardly. He thought that it was actually his younger brother who was officially representing the Jin clan in this challenge event. Why? He wondered, should he have to accept this ridiculous challenge from Ma Cholsu, who was not even an official participant in the engagement function himself? With a calm, almost indifferent expression, Jin Yeomyung began to turn as if to walk away. As he did so, he made a pointed remark, asking Ma Cholsu if his brother was so weak that he needed Ma Cholsu to pick fights for him in the shadows. Gu Cheol, witnessing this exchange, was utterly confused and shocked by his master's surprisingly bold and dismissive tone towards someone from the powerful Ma clan. He looked from side to side, unsure of how to react or what to do in this tense moment. Ma Cholsu became even more enraged by Jin Yeomyung's statement. He cursed at Jin Yeomyung, warning him not to push things too far unless he wanted the situation to escalate into a full-scale conflict between their clans. As he finished speaking, Ma Cholsu charged directly towards Jin Yeomyung, shouting loudly not to underestimate him. However, Gu Cheol was not about to stand idly by and let Ma Cholsu attack his master. Eager and determined to protect Jin Yeomyung from the approaching danger, Gu Cheol quickly adopted a fighting stance. With a serious look on his face, he reached for his sword. But Jin Yeomyung, glancing at Gu Cheol with a small smile, ordered him not to interfere, no matter what happened. Jin Yeomyung thought to himself that this was the moment to utilize his first unique ability. Ma Cholsu continued to shout, ready to strike Jin Yeomyung. But Jin Yeomyung seemed to have a sudden realization. He remembered that in his previous life, he had awakened certain heightened senses. Seeing that Jin Yeomyung was not taking any defensive action as Ma Cholsu closed in for the attack, Gu Cheol became extremely worried. He yelled out to Jin Yeomyung, reminding him that he did not even know martial arts and asking what he was trying to accomplish. But Jin Yeomyung remained as calm as a quiet river. He thought that with his awakened senses, even if he was not a match for the sword skill of Ma Cholsu's father, he was certainly far superior to the techniques of the young Ma Cholsu. With these thoughts in his mind, Jin Yeomyung made a slight turn of his body. He thought to himself that he could handle this. Just as Ma Cholsu's sword tip reached him, Jin Yeomyung caught it precisely between two of his fingers. He thought to himself that he simply needed to overwhelm his opponent. Watching this impossible feat unfold, Gu Cheol was stunned by the unexpected power displayed by his young master. With an expression that mixed both excitement and utter shock, he exclaimed the name of a legendary technique, calling it the stance of the flawless reversal. By this time, Ma Cholsu himself was in disbelief at what had just happened. Fear flickered in his eyes as he struggled to process what he was seeing. He had always known Jin Yeomyung as a weakling who possessed no martial arts skill. It was widely known throughout the region that Jin Yeomyung was considered a good-for-nothing. Likewise, Gu Cheol remained deeply confused by the scene he had just witnessed. Covering his mouth in astonishment, he whispered to himself, wondering how this could be possible. Just yesterday, his master had been a carefree person with absolutely no martial arts experience. Yet today, he had not only easily defended himself, but had also defeated a martial artist from the Blood Dragon demonic clan using just one step and two fingers. While these bewildered thoughts raced through Gu Cheol's mind, Jin Yeomyung looked away from the stunned Ma Cholsu and called out, ordering someone to take him away. He could sense the presence of people hiding nearby. Jin Yeomyung then addressed the security personnel from the Blood Dragon demonic clan, suggesting that Ma Cholsu would likely become agitated once he woke up and they should make sure to restrain him. The guards understood the implication of Jin Yeomyung's suggestion. Jin Yeomyung then hinted to them that they should follow this instruction unless they wanted him to inform everyone that Ma Chol-soo had suffered a humiliating defeat at his hands. Before Ma Chol-soo's guards could take him away, Jin Yeomyung stopped them. He added one last thing with a grin on his face, lifting his index finger playfully. He commented that he probably hadn't broken Ma Chol-soo too badly, suggesting he had held back somewhat. He then mused aloud that if word got out about the Jin clan crushing the heir of the Ma clan, it would likely cause significant trouble, wouldn't it? The scene shifted to a vast front yard, likely part of a large estate or castle, perhaps belonging to the Jin clan, as suggested by the previous events. This area was protected and surrounded by imposing walls. About 24 people were stationed neatly along either side of the path, all bowing respectfully towards Jin Yeomyung as he arrived. An older man then hurried forward, bowing even lower with great respect towards Jin Yeomyung. He welcomed the young master home and gestured forward with his hands, asking if Jin Yeomyung had enjoyed his brief trip with his friends. Jin Yeomyung responded that it was difficult to say. He recalled the memory of his father traveling all the way to the sparring hall just to personally drag him back home. Considering that the elderly man was the chief administrator, in charge of managing all the clan's affairs, he likely knew exactly what had happened. So, Jin Yeomyung thought it was a bit pointless for the old man to ask such a question. However, bound by courtesy, the chief administrator could not openly embarrass his young master, so he kept the knowledge to himself. Joking slightly, Jin Yeomyung remarked that Chief Bayok could be quite cheeky at times. Continuing the conversation, Chief Bayok responded with a knowing smile, his face mostly hidden by his full beard and mustache, and a slight grin playing on his lips. He stated that he had merely been concerned for the young master's well-being. Jin Yeomyung shrugged off the comment and declared that enough had been said about that. In a somewhat urgent tone, he instructed Chief Bayok to forget about all that and immediately grant him access to the training room. This request was the first time Chief Bayok had ever heard his young master demand access to the training hall. His confusion was evident in his tone and expression, which he could not hide. He asked, "Sorry, what did you just say? Wait, are you going to train in martial arts?" At this moment, not just Chief Bayok, but all the other attendants present were shocked to hear that the young master had asked for the keys to the training hall. Jin Yeomyung was slightly annoyed by the surprised reaction he received from his attendants. He asked them if they were being serious. Looking towards the elder Chief Bayok, he added that while he was at it, he should also retrieve a few specific martial arts scrolls from the clan's archives. With that instruction, Jin Yeomyung began to list the names of the scrolls he wanted delivered to him. Recalling his past life, Jin Yeomyung remembered a time when he was an apprentice being trained by his master. His master had pointed to a few scrolls on a table and told him that if he truly mastered those techniques, he would become invincible. But in his previous life, Jin Yeomyung had not been interested in becoming a hero. He had wanted to live a carefree life, enjoying himself and chasing after girls. So, he had been completely inattentive and unconcerned by the prospect of invincibility. His mentor had even shouted at him, asking if he was even listening. Jin Yeomyung, in that memory, appeared goofy, holding 3 jars of liquid, and commented nonchalantly that those weren't even the full versions, just excerpts. The unfortunate truth was that the main clan building in his previous life had been caught in a massive fire, and these were the only remaining scrolls that had been saved. He thought to himself that, in his previous life, training with only half of the complete technique had not seemed worth the effort. Continuing his recollection, Jin Yeomyung remembered that these martial arts never had the chance to truly shine because they had fallen into the hands of the Jin clan, whose people focused mainly on brute strength. In that memory, he opened one of the jars and suggested to his mentor that they should just continue drinking more alcohol, and his mentor had agreed. But in this current life, Jin Yeomyung recalled that the fire at the main clan estate would not happen for another 4 years. This, he realized, was why these scrolls were still intact. Now, in his hands were 2 scrolls. In his right hand, he held the Heaven-Soaring Divine Art, while in his left, he had the Ten-Fang Divine Sword Art. Jin Yeomyung carefully placed both scrolls down, noting that the Jin clan's standard techniques focused on palm strikes and kicks, which wasn't really suited to his style. He then strapped a strap around his hand and stated that he did, however, possess exceptional natural talent, outstanding perception, and a solid foundation of internal energy. Thinking that he might not encounter his mentor again in this life, due to the changes he had already made, he sat down in a cross-legged position. With a serious and determined expression, Jin Yeomyung declared that he would become the grandmaster his mentor had always dreamed of him becoming in his previous life. A heavy look settled on his face, and Jin Yeomyung looked down, quietly apologizing to Cheon Yura. He told her, "I am sorry, cult leader, but I don't think I'll be able to keep my promise to seduce you, because at my current level, you would just reject me anyway." He then shouted out his resolve. 5 years. He would isolate himself and dedicate himself entirely to martial arts for at least 5 years. After he had significantly increased his strength, he would find and eliminate those treacherous individuals from the heaven-defying society. This way, when the day came for her to become the cult leader, at the very least, her rule would not be threatened. As Jin Yeomyung made these promises to himself, he thought of the gentle, final smile Cheon Yura had shown him on her deathbed in their previous life. Then, as if struck by the weight of these intense emotions, Jin Yeomyung was startled. With weary eyes, he clenched his fists, looked down, and vowed that he would do whatever was necessary to protect Cheon Yura in this life. The scene shifted forward by 2 weeks. Jin Yeomyung was walking happily uphill, followed by Gu Cheol, who called out from behind, asking if his young master was perhaps walking a bit too slowly. However, Jin Yeomyung knew exactly what was happening. With a brilliant, almost dance-like movement in his posture as he walked slowly uphill, he murmured to himself that he was the last one to arrive anyway. He thought that everyone else was simply going to be rejected, so there was no need to rush. But Gu Cheol reminded Jin Yeomyung that even if that was the case, he still couldn't treat an event of the Cheon clan lightly. As both Jin Yeomyung and Gu Cheol approached the doors to the Cheon clan estate, 2 guards standing there exchanged glances. Their expressions were agitated, and they seemed to be thinking to themselves, looking at Jin Yeomyung and Gu Cheol. He's only arriving now? Unbothered by the looks the guards gave them, Jin Yeomyung told Gu Cheol that it was fine and he would handle any consequences himself. Jin Yeomyung then recalled a memory from his past. The last time he had failed in an engagement event, his father had locked him up for a full year. He remembered the furious look on his father's face and his father's declaration that he was no longer even a viable candidate to inherit leadership of their clan. Returning to the present moment, Jin Yeomyung thought that this time, however, he had trained continuously for 5 years. Before he could finish this internal monologue, a figure was suddenly thrown violently past them. With utter surprise, both Jin Yeomyung and Gu Cheol wondered what had just happened. As they registered the event, they saw that the figure, thrown from inside the palace, had smashed through one of the doors and then slammed into the palace wall. Jin Yeomyung managed a slight, unsettling smile. He remarked that this was quite an aggressive way to greet someone, and it looked like someone had just been kicked out. Looking at the person lying on the ground, Jin Yeomyung observed his appearance. He noted the red martial robe and the blood-red dragon sword, identifying the person as Ma Jinyun from the Blood Dragon Ma clan. He commented that it had been a while since they last met. Before Jin Yeomyung could say anything more, a girl's voice was heard from within the walls of the demonic clan estate. She said it looked like the person who had just been thrown might actually be useful. She then asked if Ma Jinyun could still continue with the duel. Without any hesitation, Ma Jinyun scrambled back to his feet. With the determined cry of a warrior and his sword firmly in hand, he rushed towards the female voice, calling her the young cult leader. Jin Yeomyung swiftly turned around and found himself staring at the beautiful face of Cheon Yura. She was described as the 17-year-old heir of the heavenly, demonic Cheon clan. She had long, flowing gray hair, with strands framing her rose-red lips. Her skin was as flawless as white porcelain. Like white petals fluttering in the air, her presence seemed to create a delicate silhouette. A gentle breeze blew between Jin Yeomyung and Cheon Yura, causing actual white petals to dance in the air as they both gazed intently at each other. While they looked at each other, a single white flower was seen dropping to the floor behind Jin Yeomyung's legs. After a moment, Jin Yeomyung softly called out Cheon Yura's name. While this silent exchange took place, Ma Jinyun was seen rushing towards the entrance to the sparring area, answering Cheon Yura's call to continue their practice duel. Jin Yeomyung watched with a smug expression, his arms crossed. He remarked that it was unfortunate Ma Jinyun was not defeated yet. Gu Cheol, bewildered by this comment, seriously asked Jin Yeomyung if he was truly joking at such a time. Jin Yeomyung responded to Gu Cheol by saying they should just enjoy the show for the moment. Again, the story took a brief step back to the protagonist's last life. Jin Yeomyung remembered that in that timeline, Ma Jin-yoon had been a dropout who had simply disappeared after being knocked out cold by Cheon Yura during a sparring match. This defeat had happened from a single strike from Cheon Yura. But in contrast to the past, in this life, Ma Jin-yoon looked full of energy. He was charging towards Cheon Yura with his sword held high and a sharp, focused look in his eyes. Jin Yeomyung thought to himself that something felt wrong, that things were different. Suddenly, Ma Jin-yoon managed to land a blow on Cheon Yura, who countered his strike with her own sword. A grin appeared on her face as she commented that he was better than she had expected him to be. While observing the duel between Cheon Yura and Ma Jin-yoon, the followers of the Blood Dragon demonic clan watched with excitement and awe, proud of their young master's strong performance. Jin Yeomyung, on the other hand, was surprised and questioned inwardly if Ma Jin-yoon had always possessed such strength. However, as soon as this thought crossed Jin Yeomyung's mind, Cheon Yura delivered a powerful blow to Ma Jin-yoon's sword, causing him to lose his grip. Simultaneously, Cheon Yura delivered a hard kick to Ma Jin-yoon's stomach. He flinched in pain, was pushed back forcefully, and fell to the ground. Seeing this, Ma Jin-yoon's attendants rushed towards him, calling out to their young master. But Ma Jin-yoon, looking towards Jin Yeomyung, surprisingly called out Jin Yeomyung's name. This startled and surprised Jin Yeomyung even further, especially when Ma Jin-yoon, despite his defeat, announced that he would never lose to Jin Yeomyung. After a moment, Ma Jin-yoon got back to his feet, bowed gracefully towards Cheon Yura, and stated that it had been an honor to spar with the young cult leader. Cheon Yura responded by saying she hoped that the next time they met, he would have grown stronger. Jin Yeomyung was surprised to hear this exchange, thinking to himself, what next time? Wasn't he supposed to be rejected outright? To his surprise, Cheon Yura then suggested to Ma Jin-yoon, with a sweet smile on her face, that he should get his wounds treated at the medicine hall. Ma Jin-yoon had clearly not expected such kindness from Cheon Yura. With an excited smile, his cheeks blushing slightly and his eyes glittering with fascination, he thanked Cheon Yura for her consideration. However, on his way out, Ma Jin-yoon cast a glare at Jin Yeomyung, gritting his teeth. Jin Yeomyung, unable to understand this reaction, murmured to himself, wondering if they weren't meeting for the very first time in this life. As Jin Yeomyung had his internal thoughts, Cheon Yura slowly approached him. She called out Jin Yeomyung of the Jin clan, claiming that she had been waiting for him. Hearing this, Jin Yeomyung felt a wave of unease and wondered why she had been waiting for him. Cheon Yura had her sword pointed towards Jin Yeomyung as she approached. Seeing this, Jin Yeomyung felt a tremble. He slowly turned towards Cheon Yura, clasping both his hands nervously. Cheon Yura mentioned that the young man from the Ma clan had been quite decent. Apparently, news had already spread that Jin Yeomyung had defeated Ma Chulsu, Ma Jin-yoon's older brother, in their earlier encounter. So, Cheon Yura challenged Jin Yeomyung, saying that if he had beaten his older brother, he must be even stronger. Jin Yeomyung let out a loud sigh, thinking, oh, damn it. He then understood why Ma Jin-yoon had been glaring at him so angrily. At the same time, Cheon Yura further stated that if he failed to meet her expectations, she would be very disappointed. As she said this, Cheon Yura had a sweet but confident smile on her face, her eyes fixed intently on Jin Yeomyung, who was feeling increasingly shaken by the entire situation. In the next scene, Cheon Yura and Jin Yeomyung were locked in a fierce duel. Cheon Yura was landing heavy blows on Jin Yeomyung. Jin Yeomyung, struggling, shouted angrily that this was exactly what was wrong with the demonic cult. They tried to solve everything with brute force. As their duel continued, Cheon Yura's sword came down towards Jin Yeomyung's seemingly scared face. He thought in surprise, going for the head right from the start? What kind of exchange is this? Cheon Yura's sword then swept downwards, close to the floor. Still bewildered, Jin Yeomyung's eyes followed the movement of her blade, asking inwardly, it's supposed to be a duel, but she's coming at me as if she's trying to kill me. Jin Yeomyung, his face still showing surprise, questioned aloud who started a duel with a killing move. He was confused, thinking that she had gone easy on Ma Jin-yoon, but with him, she was acting like a completely different person. Cheon Yura's sword then arced back towards his chest. Jin Yeomyung, with great difficulty, managed to avoid the strike, shouting, "You psychotic lady!" Cheon Yura seemed momentarily confused by this outburst. She was just about to stumble and fall backward, her sword high in the air. Having heard what Jin Yeomyung had just called her, psychotic lady, she glared intently towards him. Realizing his mistake, Jin Yeomyung tried to excuse himself, saying he didn't mean it. However, Cheon Yura did not take the insult lightly. She became visibly angry and began attacking Jin Yeomyung with renewed ferocity, shouting, "Fine, in that case, face the sword of the psychotic lady." Jin Yeomyung was struggling desperately to keep up with her swift, fierce strikes. However, with immense difficulty, he managed to parry every blow. Their swords clashed against each other, creating loud metallic sounds and brief flashes of light with each impact. Jin Yeomyung thought to himself that he would take a few hits and try to wrap the duel up quickly. But as if she understood exactly what Jin Yeomyung was planning to do, Cheon Yura seemed to become aware of his intentions. Gritting her teeth in anger, she released a dark red aura around herself and cursed at Jin Yeomyung. Looking at how the situation was escalating, Jin Yeomyung was taken aback. He was both shocked and scared, noting that Cheon Yura had released her immense dark aura. She shouted towards Jin Yeomyung that he had been hiding his true strength, and she attacked him again. Jin Yeomyung was surprised at this point, wondering how she knew he was hiding his true strength. But as he looked at her attack, he was bewildered because what he was seeing in Cheon Yura's sword was her actual sword aura. Thinking back to Cheon Yura's duel with Ma Jinyun earlier, Jin Yeomyung recalled that she had only deflected Ma Jinyun's attacks, but against him, she was using devastating sword aura. While all of this was happening, Cheon Yura's sword strike connected with Jin Yeomyung, who had a very scared look on his face. He could not fully understand what was actually happening. With this powerful strike, Cheon Yura pushed Jin Yeomyung away forcefully. Jin Yeomyung hit the wall behind him hard with his head and coughed up a stream of yellow liquid from his mouth. However, Cheon Yura was not fazed by the sight. She declared loudly to Jin Yeomyung, accusing him of trying to fake a loss while still hiding his true strength from her. She glared further at Jin Yeomyung with an angry expression, releasing even more of her aura. She demanded to know how he dared to belittle her and questioned if he finally intended to show his full strength to her. Jin Yeomyung, looking up from his position slumped against the wall, insisted that he had never once fought insincerely. However, Cheon Yura did not accept this. Still glaring angrily at him, she called out to Jin Yeomyung, accusing him of being a bastard who was feigning ignorance to the very end. The scene then shifted back to Jin Yeomyung's previous life, where Cheon Yura was sitting on her chair, looking up at Jin Yeomyung. This was the point in time when the demonic pavilion was under attack by the combined forces of the Orthodox and unorthodox martial alliances. In that memory, Jin Yeomyung was saying that he had never been insincere, not even once. It was just that his sincerity in that moment did not lie in winning that particular duel. The scene then returned to the current time. Cheon Yura's sword was now radiating a huge amount of bloody red aura. Cheon Yura asked Jin Yeomyung if deceiving her was his true intention. She then proclaimed that if that was the case, she would kill him as he wished. As she spoke, hundreds of swords materialized around her in the air. Gu Chil was terrified for Jin Yeomyung's life and cried out to his young master, warning him that if he couldn't block this attack, he would truly die. While Gu Chil was expressing his fear for his young master, Jin Yeomyung got to his feet. He placed one foot forward, preparing himself for the incoming attack. Cheon Yura, with a serious look on her face, called out the name of her powerful technique, the Heaven-Slaying Demon Sword Art, 6 Phantom Demon Strikes. As soon as she finished speaking, 6 spectral blades shot towards Jin Yeomyung. Jin Yeomyung shouted out, acknowledging the incoming attack. To counter this devastating move, Jin Yeomyung also released his own sword art, calling out the 10-Fang Divine Sword Art, the First Fang Heavenly. But before he could complete the name of his technique, he was struck by Cheon Yura's attack on his hands, his chest, and throughout his body. A blade grazed his cheek, and blood began to seep from the cut. Cheon Yura raised her sword again and quickly closed the distance between herself and Jin Yeomyung, striking another blow. But this time, Jin Yeomyung was able to counter that attack and pushed Cheon Yura back. Jin Yeomyung could feel the immense strength of the attack in his hand. With that last block, his hand was trembling, as was his entire body, but he was surprised that he had managed to block it at all. Cheon Yura, with a wide grin and a smile on her face, asked if he had blocked her attack again. Jin Yeomyung, scared, looked up with his mouth wide open and shouted out in disbelief, "No way. Damn it, she's only 18, yet she already knows how to use enhanced aura." Jin Yeomyung admitted to himself that he knew Cheon Yura had already surpassed the peak level for someone her age, but even so, this was absolutely insane. While he was contemplating this, Cheon Yura's aura closed in towards Jin Yeomyung's neck. Jin Yeomyung closed his eyes, thinking to himself that this was the end. Then, since nothing happened, he slowly opened his eyes. With his eyes half open, he wondered why he wasn't dead yet. To his surprise, the attack that Cheon Yura had unleashed had been completely destroyed by the elderly person. This person jokingly remarked to Cheon Yura, "You are planning to destroy the cult with that strike, are you?" Jin Yeomyung, his eyes wide with realization, immediately dropped to his knees on the floor. Placing both hands on the ground, he offered the highest form of greeting to the Supreme Leader, acknowledging the descent of the Heavenly Demon. He proclaimed, "All hail the Heavenly Demon." While still kneeling on the floor, Jin Yeomyung further stated, "We pay respects to the true Supreme of the Divine Cult." The figure of the Heavenly Demon King, Cheon Taejong, turned toward Cheon Yura, his posture conveying a deep seriousness. His eyes were held tightly shut, and a grave expression settled upon his features as he addressed her. His voice carried a stern tone as he informed her that her actions that very day had brought their divine group to the brink of initiating a considerable internal conflict. Meanwhile, Jin Yeomyung, who had risen from his kneeling position on the ground, lifted his gaze to observe the imposing leader. He reflected silently upon the vast history of their ancient group, which extended back for more than a millennium, and the profound fact that this man represented only the third individual ever to attain the highest position within their ranks. Furthermore, he held the significant role as the 28th person to guide the Heavenly Demon Divine Cult, and currently stood as the foremost authority across all the various entities collectively recognized as the demonic faction. However, within the space of merely a heartbeat, Cheon Taejong's countenance underwent a remarkable transformation, shifting to display a rather foolish and somewhat weary appearance. He proceeded to declare that if the distinguished Cheon family and the prominent Jin family had indeed engaged in a dispute among themselves, then it was inevitable that every person who supported either faction would have been inescapably drawn into the ensuing turmoil. He elaborated further, explaining that while such an internal struggle was unfolding, the principal strength and focus of their entire group would regrettably be directed elsewhere, leaving their core vulnerable and exposed. In that critical moment, the opposing organizations, collectively identified as the Orthodox Alliance, would undoubtedly have launched a swift and decisive assault, seizing upon the opportunity as if they had discovered the most perfect and advantageous chance imaginable. Cheon Yura absorbed this extensive explanation, but found herself unable to raise her head to look upon her father's face. She maintained a respectful stance with her head bowed low, keeping her eyes steadfastly fixed upon the ground throughout the duration of Cheon Taejong's lengthy discourse. Jin Yeomyung listened attentively to the words being spoken and considered privately that the description of the potential events might have been framed with a touch more theatricality than was strictly necessary. Yet he conceded inwardly that the leader was unquestionably correct regarding the inherent danger of the situation. Nevertheless, he retained the conviction that there was virtually no possibility the formidable Azura King, Jin Gunake, would have deliberately instigated a full-blown internal conflict merely because a child he had seemingly abandoned or given up hope on had met their demise. Subsequently, Cheon Taejong conveyed his desire for Cheon Yura to offer an apology to Jin Yeomyung. In response, Cheon Yura clenched her hand into a tight fist, her hand trembling discernibly, betraying the contained anger she felt. In her other hand, she gripped the hilt of her sword. She pressed her lips together firmly, her expression clearly indicating her profound reluctance and unwillingness to comply with this particular instruction. Unexpectedly, a faint, dark purple energy appeared to emanate from the area behind her back, subtly rising into the air. With a sharp and challenging look in her eyes, she cast a brief glance toward Jin Yeomyung. Then, in a voice that sounded palpably unwilling and forced, She uttered the words indicating her apology. Almost precisely at the same instant she spoke the reluctant apology, she dramatically lifted her sword high above her head, as if performing an action to illustrate clearly that her words did not represent a genuine expression of sorrow originating from her heart, but rather a statement she was being compelled to voice under duress. Jin Yeomyung witnessed this entire revealing display from Cheon Yura. He responded simply by commenting that the matter was acceptable and that Cheon Yura should not burden herself by contemplating it any further. He amused himself internally how utterly strange and improbable it was that he would live to witness the day when the typically cold and seemingly unfeeling figure known as the demonic empress, Cheon Yura, would ever extend an apology to anyone. The manner in which the various families and individuals were formally arranged and organized within the hierarchical structure of the cult resembled the shape of a tall pyramid. Positioned at the very apex of this structure was the esteemed Cheon family, holding the ultimate authority. Situated directly below them were the distinguished clans considered to be of the sixth rank within the cult's complex ordering. And occupying the very bottom layer were all the numerous regular followers and ordinary members of the group. This rigidly defined structure constituted the fundamental organizational framework of the heavenly demonic divine cult. The governing principle enforced strictly within this powerful group was that only the strongest and most capable individuals would manage to survive the rigorous challenges and succeed in moving upward through the ranks. Cheon Taejong, whose eyes once again seemed to hold a somewhat silly and tired quality, directed his gaze downward toward Jin Yeomyung. He spoke quietly, seemingly to himself, remarking that it appeared the Jin family had indeed nurtured and raised a rather capable young person. Then, as if a fresh thought had suddenly occurred to him, Cheon Taejong's voice grew noticeably louder as he posed a question, inquiring whether Jin Yeomyung was not, in fact, supposed to be the individual specifically chosen to inherit the leadership position of his family. He proceeded to elaborate, explaining that in accordance with the ancient and sacred laws of the heavenly demon divine cult, the primary male member of a family holding the sixth rank, whether it was the current head of the family or the designated individual intended to assume that role in the future, was explicitly forbidden from becoming the close partner or associate of the young leader of the cult. The person formally recognized as the next in line to eventually assume command. This constituted a strict and unyielding rule enforced within the heavenly demon divine cult, specifically governing matters of rank and formal position within their complex hierarchy. Jin Yeomyung maintained his respectful kneeling position, with his left hand carefully placed upon his bent left leg, and his head continuing to be directed downwards. He offered a response to Cheon Taejong's pointed question, patiently explaining that his own assessed skills and overall suitability for the role had been formally judged as insufficient to meet the necessary requirements. Consequently, his younger brother had been selected instead to be the one who would ultimately inherit the significant responsibility of leading their family. However, when Cheon Taejong received this unexpected answer, he was visibly taken completely by surprise. His face openly displayed his profound shock, with his already red eyes opening wide in astonishment. He challenged Jin Yeomyung directly, asking if his qualifications were truly deemed insufficient. He recalled the recent intense confrontation that had occurred between Jin Yeomyung and Cheon Yura. He felt certain that Jin Yeomyung had demonstrated remarkable skill and proficiency with a sword during that particular exchange. Although Cheon Yura had been unable to fully comprehend the depth and nature of the abilities she was witnessing, Cheon Taejong, holding the ultimate position as the top leader and supreme figure of the cult, possessed a keen understanding and knew very well that Jin Yeomyung was not nearly as weak or lacking in capability as he was currently presenting himself to be. Therefore, with a light-hearted gesture and accompanying it with a loud, booming laugh, he declared that Jin Yeomyung's skills were indeed lacking, and he now fully understood the complexities of the situation. In any case, he concluded definitively, Jin Yeomyung was stating that he was not the individual who would inherit his family's leadership role. Was that a correct understanding of the situation? Jin Yeomyung, with a look of relaxed composure in his eyes, turned his head away slightly from Cheon Taejong and calmly confirmed that the statement was indeed true. He added simply that he had only come to this location to fulfill his assigned duty as a devoted member of the Jin family. Cheon Taejong then remarked that since this was the existing situation, it was imperative that Jin Yeomyung continue to see that duty through to its very end. Jin Yeomyung was momentarily caught off guard and surprised by the implication of what he was hearing. His surprised face lifted upwards, and he spoke almost without conscious thought, stating that, of course, he would fulfill his duty. But before he could fully commit himself with absolute certainty, he quickly corrected his statement, asking for a brief moment of understanding regarding the sudden turn of events. Turning his back purposefully and beginning to walk away from the two young people standing before him, Cheon Taejong stated that when the next planned meeting or formal exchange between the families or individuals occurred, they would ensure that the Jin family was properly notified. Hearing this surprising news, both Jin Yeomyung and Cheon Yura were taken aback and profoundly surprised by the remarkable speed with which the entire situation had shifted and developed. They found themselves completely unsure of how they were supposed to respond to this unexpected and sudden turn of events. With looks of deep confusion etched upon their faces, they were unable to find any appropriate words to articulate their thoughts and reactions, and consequently, they simply remained standing in stunned silence. With his back still directed away from them, Cheon Taejong spoke once more to Jin Yeomyung, expressing his hope that he would witness the young man interacting harmoniously and getting along well with his dear Cheon Yura again at some point in the future. Since he did not receive any verbal response from Jin Yeomyung, he turned his head back slightly to look directly at the young man. With a look in his eyes and a tone in his voice that seemed to carry a subtle hint of threat or warning, he questioned Jin Yeomyung, asking him directly why he was not providing an answer. Jin Yeomyung was again startled by the directness of the question and spoke with noticeable difficulty, managing to say that he understood the cult leader's instruction. However, deep within his own mind, he was contemplating with growing concern that he had suddenly found himself in a truly serious and precarious situation. Cheon Taejong appeared genuinely pleased and satisfied by the manner in which everything had ultimately concluded. He let out a laugh and spoke quietly to himself, remarking that it had been a considerable period of time since he had last seen Jin Gun AK, and perhaps he ought to consider going and sharing a drink with that particularly troublesome fellow from the Jin family. Jin Yeomyung, still unable to fully grasp or understand the strange and unexpected way in which the entire situation had developed, thought to himself with a rising sense of frustration that the whole outcome had now become a complete and utter mess. He felt an intense certainty that with merely a few simple words, Cheon Taejong had casually discarded all of his previous careful plans as if they were utterly worthless and insignificant. In the very next moment, Cheon Yura turned her face and angled her body away from Jin Yeomyung, creating a physical distance between them. She stated clearly that she would not offer him a personal apology directly from herself. She firmly asserted that it was undeniably true that she was the individual who had been tricked or deceived during the earlier events. She continued speaking, her voice carrying a distinct tone of sadness, saying that she was fully aware that her father had merely put on that elaborate act for a specific purpose. Still, she added, acknowledging the authority of the situation, it was the cult leader's direct command, and therefore, even if she felt no personal happiness about the instruction, she would ultimately obey it. But before she could utter any further words or explanations, Jin Yeomyung promptly stood up from his position, raised his hand slightly, as if signaling for her pause, and asked her to wait and hold on for a brief moment. He then stated in a clear voice that he did not harbor feelings of hatred towards her. This surprising statement came as a complete shock to Cheon Yura, as she had absolutely not anticipated hearing such words expressed by Jin Yeomyung. It felt profoundly unusual and unexpected. Consequently, Cheon Yura was visibly taken aback and deeply shocked by his declaration. She simply responded by asking what he meant by those words, seeking clarification. Jin Yeomyung's thoughts immediately drifted back to the final, painful moments of his previous life, vividly recalling the image of Cheon Yura's hand, stained with the chilling color of blood, holding his frightened and vulnerable face. With his eyes looking deliberately off to the side, away from Cheon Yura, Jin Yeomyung reiterated that it was not that he felt hatred toward her. In fact, he mumbled quietly and almost inaudibly to himself. He actually liked her, although he deliberately kept this part of his thought unspoken and hidden from her ears. Suddenly realizing the potentially loaded implications of what he had just said aloud, even partially, Jin Yeomyung quickly moved to explain himself further and clarify his intended meaning. He stated emphatically that, of course, he did not mean his words in a romantically loving way. He intended it more as an expression of admiration for her capabilities. Therefore, he pleaded with her earnestly, she should please make every effort not to misunderstand the true meaning behind his words. As he provided his explanation and vigorously attempted to justify the statement he had just made, Jin Yeomyung was visibly trembling, and his physical movements clearly conveyed a sense of begging or desperate entreaty. Cheon Yura found herself completely at a loss as to how she should properly react to this sudden and unexpected declaration from Jin Yeomyung. She felt a deep sense of confusion and at the same time was unable to find any suitable words to articulate her response. Looking away from Cheon Yura once more and directing his gaze off to the side, Jin Yeomyung cleared his throat before speaking again. He stated that in any case, the actions he had taken and the things that had transpired that day had no personal connection to her specifically as an individual. Again, shifting the tone of her voice, Cheon Yura instructed him to wait for a moment. With a calm and composed expression settling upon her face, she stated firmly that during this particular interaction between them, they were standing on equal ground and were to be considered peers. There is absolutely no necessity or requirement for him to address her using the formal title of the young cult leader. Jin Yeomyung was profoundly surprised and visibly shocked by this unexpected assertion. With a blank and uncomprehending look in his eyes, he asked her what he should call her instead if he was not to use her formal title. Now, it was Cheon Yura's turn to experience surprise, as she had clearly not anticipated this question and did not immediately know how to provide a suitable answer. So, with a similarly confused expression and blank eyes, she began thinking quietly to herself, mentally searching for an appropriate and acceptable name he could use. Seeing that Cheon Yura also appeared unsure and hesitant, Jin Yeomyung then offered a suggestion, proposing that in that specific circumstance, he would call her Lady Cheon Yura. In the subsequent scene, Gu Chil and Jin Yeomyung were observed walking away from the imposing and large building of Heavenly Demon Pavilion. Situated behind them stood the massive, formidable walls and the grand gate that marked the entrance to the building. Gu Chil was visibly in a state of great happiness and excitement. He expressed his feelings enthusiastically, saying that the outcome was truly wonderful and that the young master, Jin Yeomyung, had genuinely displayed remarkable ability and had been absolutely amazing. Jin Yeomyung offered a response to Gu Chil's overly excited comments by simply saying yes. Yes, of course, although it was clear that he did not put a great deal of effort or enthusiasm into his reply. Gu Chil, still exhibiting excessive excitement and walking closely behind his young lord, remarked that the family head would undoubtedly be absolutely thrilled and overjoyed by this significant news. Then, with a look of clear dislike appearing on his face, he added a dismissive comment that it seemed the young person from the Ma family had also managed to survive the recent events. Throughout the entire distance from the area encompassing the buildings belonging to the demonic clans all the way to the private living quarters designated for the Jin family, Gu Chil proved completely unable to restrain or contain his overwhelming excitement concerning what his young master had successfully achieved that day. He continued talking proudly the entire duration of the walk, offering extensive and heartfelt praise for the young master's notable success. As they drew closer to the imposing gates of their own living area, he was still speaking happily, reiterating that the young master had even managed to gain personal recognition and acknowledgement from the revered heavenly demon king himself. Gu Chil's enthusiasm was clearly boundless and could not be contained. As they were in the process of entering the main building of their residence, Chief Bayok greeted the two individuals at the door, offering a polite salutation to the young master. While Gu Chil was loudly and effusively praising the young master's accomplishments for everyone within earshot, Jin Yeomyung was privately contemplating in the quiet confines of his own mind about what would happen next, and how his carefully planned period of intensive training and isolation had been regrettably ruined by the day's events. However, while Jin Yeomyung was engrossed in these thoughts and walking forward inside the building, his younger brother was also positioned at the door, patiently waiting specifically to greet his older brother upon his return. He remarked that Jin Yeomyung had finally returned home. Jin Yeomyung looked directly at his younger brother and inquired why he had personally come out to greet him at the entrance. Jin Yeomyung's younger brother explained that he had heard Jin Yeomyung was planning to undertake solitary training before proceeding to the area known as the Lesser Demon Hall. Then, with a look of clear disgust and disdain appearing on his face, the younger brother shouted aggressively toward Jin Yeomyung, demanding that he not dare to suggest that he was now attempting to become the designated individual to inherit the family's leadership position. This strong and imposing young man, who possessed the same distinct color eyes as Jin Yeomyung and stood tall and imposing in front of him, was Jin Yeomyung, the individual widely believed to be the future head of the Jin family within the complex hierarchy of the demonic heavens. Jin Yeomyung, being of shorter stature, was required to look upwards at his younger brother, Jin Yeomyung. He offered a response to Jin Yeomyung's demanding and accusatory question by suggesting that surely his brother was already well aware of the established laws and rules concerning this matter. But Jin Yeomyung was clearly not willing to listen to or accept this explanation. He continued speaking forcefully, stating that a close connection or association with the young leader of the cult could be formally arranged at any time deemed suitable, and that such a connection did not constitute a problem or represent a stopping point preventing other possibilities. Jin Yeomyung thought privately to himself that Jin Yeomyung, who physically resembled a large, strong bear in appearance, was unexpectedly sharp-witted and surprisingly intelligent for his relatively young age. But Jin Yeomyung remained steadfast in his refusal to accept Jin Yeomyung's words or explanation. He shouted angrily at Jin Yeomyung, vehemently stating that he did not accept or formally recognize him as his brother. He continued his harsh pronouncements, declaring that Jin Yeomyung did not properly belong within the esteemed Jin family lineage. Jin Yeomyung then spoke out in response, asking if Jin Yeomyung was simply expressing such harsh and sudden truths without any preamble or consideration. Positioned behind Jin Yeomyung, Gu Cheol was attempting to gently de-escalate and calm the tense situation. With a gentle voice and a pleading manner, he stated that the second young master was perhaps going too far with his accusations and language. He patiently explained that the first young master had unequivocally demonstrated great skill and proven his worth during his recent exchange when he had contended against the young leader of the cult earlier that day. Hearing this defense from Gu Cheol, Jin Yeomyung became even more intensely angry. With sharp, piercing eyes, he shouted fiercely at Gu Cheol, verbally attacking him by calling him a person of low status, referencing his past as a former killer, and aggressively questioning how he dared to interfere in a private discussion occurring directly between those born directly into the distinguished Jin family bloodline. This overt display of intense anger emanating from Jin Yeomyung greatly frightened Chief Bayok, who was standing nervously and apprehensively behind Gu Cheol, witnessing the heated exchange. Jin Yeomyung let out a long, audible breath, releasing some of his own tension. Thinking silently to himself, he felt strongly that Jin Yeomyung was being excessively dramatic and theatrical in his behavior and pronouncements. He questioned inwardly whether his brother was genuinely serious in his accusations and whether this kind of inflammatory talk was truly originating from someone who was only 16 years old. He wondered with a sense of exasperation how anyone could manage to be so incredibly irritating. Then, with an angry look fixing upon his face and placing his hands firmly on his waist, visibly grinding his teeth together in frustration, he spoke out loudly and forcefully, asking how Jin Yeomyung dared to speak to him in such a disrespectful manner. He added pointedly that it appeared he would have to personally undertake the task of correcting Jin Yeomyung's problematic and arrogant attitude so that his family would not cause significant issues or problems for him in the future. A wave of profound surprise washed over Jin Yeomyung upon hearing the unexpected declaration, an expression of disbelief clearly settling upon his face. Allowing a faint smile, which soon broadened into a noticeable grin, to play upon his features, he conveyed his query to Jin Yeomyung, asking if the seriousness of the situation and the words just spoken were truly real at that precise instant. Within his own mind, Jin Yeomyung reiterated his internal conviction that his younger sibling, the one destined to inherit the weighty responsibility of leading their entire lineage in the years to come, desperately needed to acquire a fundamental understanding of proper respect towards his elder brother. Acting upon this thought, he proceeded to deliberately twist his fingers tightly around Jin Yeomyung's hand, applying a calculated amount of pressure that forced a pained cry from the surprised younger man's lips. Maintaining the same unperturbed smile, Jin Yeomyung remarked narratively that, upon reflection, it occurred to him they had never truly engaged in a physical struggle against one another before that day, suggesting that it was a common saying in other families that brothers would often engage in such contests until a deeper closeness developed between them. Unable to tolerate the sharp ache radiating through his hand and the increasing sense of irritation provoked by his brother's actions, Jin Yeomyung reacted instinctively, attempting to land a forceful punch upon Jin Yeomyung. Yet the elder sibling effortlessly shifted his body, smoothly evading the incoming strike with practiced ease. A flush of anger began to color Jin Yeomyung's face as he frustratedly demanded to understand why Jin Yeomyung persistently moved away from him, likening his brother's evasiveness to the quick movements of a small, startled creature attempting to escape capture. However, Jin Yeomyung maintained his calm demeanor and his perpetual smile, skillfully weaving and dodging every single one of the punches that Jin Yeomyung desperately aimed in his direction, suggesting narratively that perhaps the real issue lay not in his own movement, but in Jin Yeomyung's apparent inability to connect with even a single blow. The frustration visibly intensified, causing Jin Yeomyung's face to deepen to a vivid shade of red as his anger boiled over. Gathering a significant amount of powerful energy within his clenched fist, he vocalized his intent, stating loudly and clearly that he was about to inflict serious physical harm upon Jin Yeomyung with the force of his impending attack. Without further hesitation, Jin Yeomyung launched his initial, most powerful offensive maneuver, declaring the technical name of his technique with a resonant shout, referring to it specifically as the threefold devastating strikes. Yet despite the apparent power of the attack, Jin Yeomyung once again demonstrated his remarkable agility, smoothly avoiding the entire assault without apparent difficulty. Still shouting with intense emotion at Jin Yeomyung, Jin Yeomyung questioned narratively how his brother could possibly presume to address him in such a disrespectful manner. He then proceeded to clearly articulate the primary motivations that had driven him to challenge Jin Yeomyung to this confrontation, explaining that there were in fact three critically important reasons behind his actions. He began by outlining the first and arguably most significant point, stating that while Jin Yeomyung might indeed have been selected to be recognized as one of the 6 exceptionally important individuals known colloquially as the 6 demon dragons, it remained an undeniable truth that there would invariably exist someone possessing even greater strength and capability than he. As Jin Yeomyung calmly conveyed these justifications for his actions, Jin Yeomyung continued to throw a barrage of punches in rapid succession towards him, a relentless series of strikes that Jin Yeomyung managed to avoid with what appeared to be complete and utter effortlessness, sidestepping each attack without allowing any of them to land. Jin Yeomyung then continued his explanation, moving on to detail the second compelling reason for initiating the fight, which he explained was that Jin Yeomyung had shown a shocking lack of regard, daring to insult the esteemed reputation and good name of the Jin family, the very lineage that Jin Yeomyung himself was destined to lead one day in the future. As he spoke these words, Jin Yeomyung executed a quick, precise movement, striking a blow against Jin Yeomyung not with his fist, but utilizing the sturdy handle of his sword, adding another layer to the physical confrontation. While the two brothers were locked in this unexpected battle, the various individuals who served and worked within the Jin family's household stood, watching the unfolding fight, with expressions of profound astonishment. Their disbelief was palpable. They simply could not reconcile the scene before them with their long-held perceptions of Jin Yeomyung, whom they had consistently regarded as someone unlikely to achieve significant success, someone who possessed little to no discernible skill in martial combat. Gu Chiel, a grin mixed with bewildered surprise etched upon his face, remarked narratively that the behavior of the first young master had undeniably undergone a remarkable transformation. Chief Byok added his agreement, suggesting that this perceived change indeed appeared to be an accurate observation. The other assembled onlookers from the Jin household collectively voiced their shared sentiment, recounting that Jin Yeomyung had previously been characterized by laziness and expressing genuine wonder as to precisely when he might have developed such a serious and focused disposition. They made a notable point, observing that while the second young master, Jin Yeomyung, held the impressive title of a demon dragon at the tender age of 16, it was clearly Jin Yeomyung who was gaining the upper hand and emerging victorious in the current exchange. Even as the various servants and household members exchanged these surprise comments among themselves, Jin Yeomyung's attempts to fight back had been completely overwhelmed, leading to his utter defeat at the hands of Jin Yeomyung. He now found himself kneeling on the ground, a posture of clear submission. His head bore several noticeable bumps, and his clothing was disheveled and messy, bearing the marks of the struggle. With his head bowed low and a gesture of humility and acknowledgement of his defeat, he expressed narratively that he would carefully consider and seriously follow the counsel offered by his older brother. However, Jin Yeomyung interrupted Jin Yeomyung's words, stopping him from concluding his statement. Addressing his younger sibling affectionately, referring to him as his dear Jin Yeomyung, he requested that he not depart just yet, inquiring if he had no interest in hearing the final, crucial reason behind the initiation of the fight. A look of apprehension, even fear, flickered in Jin Yeomyung's eyes as he cautiously raised his gaze to meet Jin Yeomyung's, asking narratively what that ultimate motivation could possibly be. Jin Yeomyung looked down upon the kneeling figure of Jin Yeomyung. A cruel smile spread across his face, mirrored by the unsettling feeling reflected in his eyes, as he declared that the concluding reason was simply because Jin Yeomyung had failed to demonstrate the appropriate level of respect and deference due to his elder brother. As he articulated this final reason, his sword, which he held in his hand, began to emit a strange, dark, and distinctly evil-looking purplish energy, a visible manifestation of some potent internal power. Yeomyung was visibly confused and frightened by the sight of this unusual energy radiating from the blade, questioning narratively when his brother had possibly acquired the ability to utilize sword energy. He then began to express that perhaps he had not adequately conveyed his boundless respect and profound admiration for his older brother. But before he could finish uttering these words of deference, Jin Yeomyung firmly interrupted him, correcting his statement with a stern tone. He explained that proper manners and true respect were not merely conveyed through empty words alone, but required more tangible demonstration. With this assertion, he proceeded to resume his physical reprimand of Jin Yeomyung, and a loud cry of pain could be clearly heard echoing across the grounds of the Jin family's residential area. As night descended and enveloped the compound in darkness, Jin Gun-ke sat within the confines of one of the rooms, leisurely sipping his wine. He remarked narratively that Jin Yeomyung had undeniably accomplished something quite remarkable and impressive that day. Jin Gun-ke continued to drink, mentioning that the leader of their cult, the heavenly demon himself, had not ceased offering words of praise regarding Jin Yeomyung's recent actions. The cult leader had even extended compliments towards Jin Gun-ke's own perceived capability, acknowledging his success in producing such a talented son who is now destined for a significant connection with the cult leader's daughter. Laughing heartily at the thought, Jin Gun-ke continued, pondering narratively precisely how he ought to interpret these various commendations and observations. A look of evident admiration filled his eyes as he directed his gaze downwards towards Jin Yeomyung, who was kneeling before him in a show of filial respect, and addressed him directly, using the paternal term son. Jin Yeomyung responded promptly, acknowledging his father's address by stating simply, "Yes, father." Jin Gun-ke then posed a direct question to his son, inquiring narratively whether Jin Yeomyung harbored the aspiration to become the ultimate successor, the one chosen to inherit the prestigious leadership of the entire Jin family. Jin Yeomyung did not provide an immediate answer to this significant question. Instead, he cast his gaze downwards towards the floor, a visibly sad expression settling upon his face, reflected in the unusual purple and pinkish hues of his eyes, as he conveyed his request to his father, asking him to please ensure that important position was preserved for Jin Yeomyung. He explained that, in stark contrast to himself, Jin Yeomyung had consistently demonstrated his inherent worth and value to their family over a significant period of time. Hearing this unexpected response from Jin Yeomyung, Jin Gun subtly narrowed his eyes, a faint hint of sadness also becoming perceptible within them. Jin Yeomyung continued to elaborate on his intentions, stating that he planned to serve closely by the side of the young individual destined to become the next cult leader and, through that dedicated service, actively work to elevate the standing and enhance the honor of their esteemed family name. Reaching for the bottle, Jin Gun-ke poured more drink into his now empty glass, his actions deliberate. He commented narratively that he had honestly not realized that Jin Yeomyung possessed such a deep level of concern for their family's honor and reputation. Jin Yeomyung offered a thoughtful reply to his father's observation. He explained that while the leaders of the other prominent families within the cult might be wasting their valuable energy and resources in internal conflicts focused solely on determining who would ultimately become the next head of their respective lineages, he and Jin Yeomyung could instead collaboratively establish a formidable base of influence and power, building strength both within the family structure itself and in the external world beyond. Then, gesturing subtly towards his own chest and holding his hand against it, Jin Yeomyung continued his thought, his voice filled with a quiet confidence. A self-assured smile touched his lips as he declared that in the upcoming generation, their Jin family would unquestionably earn the distinction of being acknowledged and referred to as the preeminent and greatest among all 6 of the large, influential families within the cult. Placing his drink down upon the table, Jin Gun-ak expressed his approval, stating narratively that the idea Jin Yeomyung presented was indeed excellent. Then, adopting a slightly playful tone in his voice, he posed a challenge to Jin Yeomyung, asking if he genuinely believed he possessed the capability to fulfill his ambitious declaration, to truly succeed in making the Jin family the most dominant and powerful among the 6 significant demonic families. Jin Yeomyung remained completely unfazed by this questioning of his capabilities. With calm assurance, he simply stated that he would ensure his vision came to fruition. Jin Gun-ak was clearly pleased by this confident response. He expressed his satisfaction, remarking that Jin Yeomyung had certainly developed into a quite impressive individual in recent times. He then conveyed his intention to offer his full support as Jin Yeomyung's father, inquiring if there was anything specific his son desired or required to aid him in his endeavors. In the subsequent scene, the bustling atmosphere of a vibrant marketplace came into view. Jin Yeomyung was observed carefully examining the various small shops lining the market area, where traders had displayed their assorted goods upon simple tables that lacked overhead coverings. One particular trader was heard loudly shouting out, enthusiastically promoting fine cloth that he claimed had originated from a distant province. Another shop attendant called out with equal fervor, announcing that everything within their establishment was offered at extremely low prices and asserting that they possessed the most inexpensive goods available anywhere within the entire Jin area. As Jin Yeomyung and his companion moved forward through this lively and busy environment, Jin Yeomyung contemplated silently to himself that since the possibility of uninterrupted personal training had now become impossible for him, it was imperative that he shift his focus and begin actively seeking to uncover the true identities and operations of the hidden organizations secretly involved in various illicit activities. A thoughtful expression settled upon his face, and he brought a hand to his chin in a gesture of contemplation, considering that the rule of the heavenly demon, the current and powerful leader of the cult, was known to be exceedingly firm and absolute. Therefore, he reasoned inwardly, these clandestine organizations must undoubtedly be continuing their operations discreetly, working beneath the surface of everyday life for the time being. While he was absorbed in these private thoughts, a voice from one of the nearby shops called out, addressing the young master and inviting him to sample one of their offerings. Jin Yeomyung, however, remained deeply lost in his internal musings, seemingly unaware of the invitation. He acknowledged silently, however, that the circumstances surrounding Cheon Yura were significantly different. There were numerous highly skilled and capable young individuals among the various families closely connected to the powerful Cheon family. Consequently, disagreements regarding which individual to lend their support to were prevalent, even existing within the Cheon family itself. As Jin Yeomyung continued to process these complex considerations, another figure was observed engaging in an interaction with a person selling fruit from a stall. The figure was heard expressing a preference for items that were not too firm, inquiring if the fruit seller had anything that possessed a softer texture. The fruit seller responded by handing the person a peach, which the individual promptly accepted and took a bite from while walking along behind Jin Yeomyung. Jin Yeomyung persisted in his internal deliberations, developing the belief that from this point forward, the investigative efforts he intended to undertake could potentially yield a significant advantage, one that possessed the capacity to exert considerable pressure upon the young cult leader in the future. Without warning, he abruptly turned around and directly addressed Jin Yeomyung, calling out his name. He inquired narratively why Jin Yeomyung was persistently following him. Jin Yeomyung, still in the process of chewing and with food visibly in his mouth, explained that his motivation for following was his curiosity, his desire to understand what precisely Jin Yeomyung had been doing in recent times to achieve such a remarkable increase in his strength. Jin Yeomyung paused for a moment, considering internally whether it was truly a wise decision to allow his younger brother to accompany him on his current undertaking. Jin Yeomyung then responded to Jin Yeomyung's statement, instructing him simply to focus on taking proper care of his own physical well-being. Jin Yeomyung, his voice filled with an air of self-assurance, placed his hands confidently on his waist and stated that such personal care was, of course, a fundamental requirement. He then asked Jin Yeomyung where exactly they were heading. As they were in the process of entering a building, Jin Yeomyung provided his answer to Jin Yeomyung, informing him that their destination was the black market. Jin Yeomyung's reaction to hearing this destination was one of clear surprise. He questioned narratively whether the black market was not a notorious location specifically designated for the buying and selling of items that were fundamentally against the established laws and regulations. He expressed his wonder as to whether it might not be a place where individuals who had violated the cult's rules and directives congregated. Jin Yeomyung, continuing his movement towards the far end of a passage from which bright lights were emanating, as if imparting significant and confidential knowledge to Jin Yeomyung, spoke in a voice that was both calm and steady in its tone. He advised Jin Yeomyung to simply retain one crucial piece of information. Within the vast expanse of the many mountains where their cult had established its dwelling places, the very concept embodied by the word illegal held almost no actual meaning. He went on to clarify that certain activities and transactions were merely kept out of the public eye and concealed because there existed no discernible benefit in allowing the regular followers of the cult to become aware of them, and thus they were maintained in secrecy in a manner deemed appropriate for such sensitive matters. Upon entering the interior of the black market itself, Jin Yeomyung continued his verbal explanation. In essence, he stated, the black market operated under the direct influence and control of one of the 6 formidable great families within the cult's hierarchy. The appearance of the black market largely resembled other similar clandestine locations, presenting an atmosphere that felt somewhat unsettling and less than entirely safe, characterized by dark, indistinct buildings and individuals who largely seemed preoccupied with their own private affairs, paying little attention to newcomers. Jin Yeomyung walked forward with purpose and remarked that the specific location they were seeking, in particular, was... He paused briefly before completing his thought, his gaze lifting to scrutinize the surrounding buildings more closely. Jin Yeomyung, who was following closely behind him, also directed his attention upwards towards the structures. At that moment, Jin Yeomyung thought inwardly that this place looked precisely as he remembered it from the period when he had been entrusted with the responsibility of managing various internal affairs within the cult. The location where Jin Yeomyung and Jin Yeomyung had arrived was known by the name the Hidden Gold Pavilion. Positioned at the entrance of the Hidden Gold Pavilion stood an elderly individual, accompanied by 4 assistants strategically placed on each side, their presence serving to formally welcome those seeking entry. Jin Yeomyung informed Jin Yeomyung that this particular establishment was the true center of power, the place that effectively controlled and managed the entire black market operation. As Jin Yeomyung and Jin Yeomyung passed through the entrance doorway, the aged person moved toward Jin Yeomyung, offering a formal welcome by addressing the respected guests from the Jin family and politely inquiring about the purpose of their visit to this location. Jin Yeomyung responded with a manner that was both playful and carried a subtle hint of mockery, stating narratively that their presence was quite clearly not related to anything that could be openly purchased or sold within the market's visible transactions. He then issued a direct command, instructing the elderly person to immediately escort him to the individual who held the most important position of authority within the establishment. Hearing this unexpected and rather imperious command emanating from the young man, the elderly person displayed a clear reaction of being taken aback, momentarily unsure of how best to respond. However, quickly recovering his composure, he offered a response that was accompanied by a clever smile, reminiscent of the cunning expression of a sly fox. He informed Jin Yeomyung that he himself was, in fact, the person in charge of this establishment, introducing himself by the name of Oh Gunjong, an individual also known by the moniker the Golden Crown Demon. Despite this self-introduction and assertion of authority, Jin Yeomyung remained unimpressed by the old man's claims. Maintaining a calm demeanor and a distinctly mocking look in his eyes, he remarked narratively that in order to appropriately deal with the eldest son of the esteemed Jin family, it was surely expected that someone from the prestigious Sa family ought to make an appearance. Wasn't that the elderly person's opinion as well? Oh Gunjong was visibly surprised by the specificity of this statement, but concurrently, he displayed a clear interest in the knowledge possessed by Jin Yeomyung. He questioned narratively how Jin Yeomyung had managed to acquire information regarding that particular detail. Jin Yeomyung, subtly closing his eyes in a gesture that combined mockery with a sly smile, spoke softly, asking what precisely Oh Gunjong believed he was referring to in terms of knowing something. Oh Gunjong, still struggling to fully comprehend the unexpected turn of events, thought silently to himself that this location was, in reality, the highly secret information section belonging to the Sa family, a lineage notoriously known as the Black Gold family. As this realization solidified in his mind, a scared expression became visible in his eyes. Then, displaying a determined attitude and allowing a wave of his powerful internal energy to become perceptible, Oh Gunjong reiterated his question to Jin Yeomyung with renewed intensity. He demanded once again to know precisely how Jin Yeomyung had come into possession of that specific piece of information. Jin Yeomyung remained completely unaffected by Oh Gunjong's display of power and determination. He calmly stated that Oh Gunjong was exhibiting an extreme level of boldness in daring to pose such a direct question to him. Then, without providing any prior warning or indication, he delivered a sharp slap across Oh Gunjong's face. Jin Yeomyung remarked narratively that while he might not possess exemplary skill in showing respect to individuals who were older than himself, he certainly knew how to effectively strike them. Jin Yeomyung then directed an angry glare towards the old person's assistant, stating that a mere helper associated with the Sa family had dared to harbor and display an intention to cause him harm, even going so far as to possess a hidden weapon concealed within his sleeve. At that very moment, a woman appeared and loudly exclaimed that the situation had escalated sufficiently. Jin Yeomyung turned his gaze towards the newly arrived lady and addressed her with a pleasant smile and a noticeably friendly demeanor, stating that it was indeed a pleasure to encounter Lady Sa once again. Lady Sa was an individual who held a direct lineage connection to the main branch of the Sa family, the renowned Black Gold clan. As she faced Jin Yeomyung, Lady Sa considered internally that a remarkably small number of people, even within their own family, were aware that this specific location was under the direct control of the Sa family. She wondered if the Jin family's capabilities in gathering sensitive information were perhaps even more advanced and effective than they had previously believed. However, Lady Sa was not as straightforward or simple an individual as her outward appearance might suggest. Sa Bayan, as she was named, possessed a secret aspect to her life. Stemming from a family historically known for its espionage activities, she also worked in a confidential capacity as a maid for the young person destined to become the next cult leader. Returning to the present moment, Sa Bayan inquired as to what specific purpose had brought the two brothers to this location. Jin Yeomyung stated that recently, an unusual and disturbing phenomenon had begun to spread throughout the area known as the Red Lantern District, as well as within the narrow and concealed streets situated behind buildings. Jin Yeomyung displayed confusion regarding Jin Yeomyung's statement, asking what strange thing he was referring to, as he himself had not received any information or news regarding such events. Jin Yeomyung continued, mentioning a specific name. He paused for a brief moment, then resumed his explanation, inquiring if the phenomenon was referred to as black spotted blood. He deliberately phrased this question in a manner intended to pique their interest and, more importantly, to observe the reactions of the individuals associated with the Sa family. Sa Bayan took a few moments to mentally process the specific information that Jin Yeomyung had introduced into the conversation. Her golden eyes widened noticeably, and an expression of shock settled upon her face, an emotional reaction that was clearly mirrored on the faces of all the Sa family members who were present. She questioned how Jin Yeomyung had become aware of that particular detail. While this exchange was unfolding between Jin Yeomyung and Sa Bayan, Jin Yeomyung recalled that he had initially acquired this piece of information from one of the women who was employed at an establishment known as the Seven-Star Courtesan House. Furthermore, This particular woman had been quite open and willing to discuss the matter. Saw Bayan, a look of clear disgust now evident on her face, questioning whether that limited piece of information was truly the full extent of Jin Yeomyung's knowledge. She then revealed a more alarming truth, stating that the black spotted blood was not merely an isolated incident, but was in fact a dangerous illness that was poised to soon begin its spread, carrying the potential to inflict harm upon the entire cult structure from within its own ranks. If one were to assume that these sinister plans had been in development for a considerable period of time, then it was logical to conclude that the black spotted sickness must constitute an integral part of someone's larger and more elaborate scheme. Saw Bayan lowered her gaze, her expression and voice conveying a sense of palpable worry. She asserted with certainty that the origin of this illness definitely stemmed from outside the confines of the cult itself. She further elaborated, explaining that even with the complete and unwavering support of their main family, they had been unable to definitively pinpoint the original source of the affliction. At best, she confessed, they strongly suspected that the black spotted blood was the work of a smaller, more secretive group operating clandestinely under the direction of one of the other 6 great families within the cult's political landscape. Feeling that he had successfully obtained the information he had sought, Jin Yeomyung turned his body, preparing to take his leave from the establishment. He called out to Jin Yeomyung, indicating that they should now depart. However, Saw Bayan quickly raised her voice, calling out to Jin Yeomyung and politely requesting that he please wait just a moment longer before leaving. Anticipating this reaction, Jin Yeomyung turned back towards Saw Bayan, a satisfied and happy expression now clearly visible upon his face. With an expression that conveyed his profound pleasure and sense of triumph, he spoke out loud, asking what she now desired or required from him. Saw Bayan, her face marked by a deeply worried expression and her gaze directed downwards, explained that under the specific condition that the problem related to the black spotted blood was resolved completely and perfectly, she had formally agreed to hand over all of the pertinent information that their family had managed to gather regarding the matter. She added that they would also assign a specific individual to work closely with the Jin family, providing assistance in monitoring and overseeing this critical issue. Jin Yeomyung felt a strong sense of victory course through him. He offered a broad smile and enthusiastically expressed his gratitude to Saw Bayan, stating that he would wholeheartedly accept full responsibility for handling the situation from that point forward. The 2 brothers, Jin Yeomyung and Jin Yeowon, then proceeded to exit the building belonging to the Saw family. Saw Bayan and Oh Gunjong remained in their positions, watching the figures of the 2 brothers gradually diminish in the distance as they moved further away. Suddenly, Saw Bayan lifted her gaze upwards towards the first floor of the building and spoke softly, indicating that the brothers were gone, addressing her words to the young cult leader. It happened that Cheon Yura was also present within the same building at that time, and she had clearly overheard the entirety of the conversation that had just taken place between Saw Bayan and Jin Yeomyung. She displayed no particular outward emotion on her face, maintaining a remarkably calm composure. With a calm expression, she mentally revisited the details of a conversation she had previously shared with her father, the esteemed heavenly demon cult leader. In that particular discussion, the cult leader had remarked narratively that Jin Yeomyung, the young man from the Jin family, did not seem to fully recognize the point at which he began to exert his complete and total effort during the duel they had recently engaged in. This discussion had centered specifically around the fight that Cheon Yura had experienced with Jin Yeomyung. Cheon Yura then inquired of her father, asking if he truly meant that Jin Yeomyung had been entirely serious throughout the duration of their fight. Cheon Taejong, in response, stroked his long facial hair thoughtfully and remarked that while it might sound somewhat peculiar, Jin Yeomyung's eyes during the confrontation had not been focused solely on the fight itself or on the objective of winning. Instead, he observed, they had been directed solely towards her, fixing upon her presence. She vividly recalled the specific details of the physical encounter that had transpired between Jin Yeomyung and herself. Returning to the present moment, Cheon Yura tightly clenched her fist, her knuckles turning white. A palpable, almost dangerous energy seemed to emanate from her as she ground her teeth together in a display of contained frustration. She spoke out loud, stating that hearing the cult leader's observation had indeed caused her to perceive Jin Yeomyung in a slightly different light than before. However, She then expressed a feeling of genuine disappointment that had arisen when she became aware that Jin Yeomyung had apparently been spending time visiting the women employed at the various courtesan houses. In a different setting, large, jagged stones were piled high on both sides, forming the walls of a narrow and winding passage. This location was identified as Yunru Valley. It was known as the valley situated furthest to the south, intentionally hidden away and recognized for being exceptionally difficult to travel through, a territory belonging to the heavenly demon divine cult. Within this particular valley, even most of the large and influential families tended to avoid venturing. It was a place where the established rules and authority of the cult held almost no actual power or sway. Jin Yeomyung and one of the individuals who worked for the Sa family's information gathering group, known specifically as Black Dagger No. 7, were in the process of moving through a street within this remote valley. Black Dagger No. 7 was entirely concealed by a protective cloth and a hat, rendering their appearance indistinct. Jin Yeomyung remarked narratively to his companion that if one truly desired to capture a powerful and formidable animal like a tiger, it was absolutely necessary to enter the tiger's own dwelling place, its den. He mentioned that their investigation into the matter had reached a standstill precisely here, indicating the specific area they were currently located within. His companion offered a counterpoint, replying that if they were to venture directly into the tiger's den, there existed a distinct possibility that they might simply end up being consumed themselves by the very creature they sought. But Jin Yeomyung displayed no visible sign of fear upon his face, while concurrently, his companion thought silently to herself that she possessed a strong aversion to entering such a place. However, without giving the matter any further deliberation, Jin Yeomyung walked confidently forward, his steps purposeful. Around them, they could clearly see numerous individuals lying upon the ground, their appearance suggesting they were afflicted with some form of illness. Jin Yeomyung then addressed his companion, Black Dagger No. 7, stating that he would personally ensure that Lady Sa was informed of the exact words she had just spoken, a remark intended to playfully threaten his companion. Black Dagger No. 7 reacted with a startled feeling, conveying that she was sorry for the comment she had made earlier. However, she continued to speak in a tone that remained somewhat mocking regarding the overall situation they found themselves in. She further questioned whether Jin Yeomyung genuinely believed he could uncover significant and important information in a place such as this one. With a sarcastic tone lacing her voice and narrowing her eyes as she scanned the surroundings, she awaited his response. Jin Yeomyung happily pinched his nose closed with his fingers, a reaction to the strong and unpleasant smell pervading the area. He confidently instructed his companion to simply observe carefully. Sometimes, he explained, it was paradoxically easier to uncover valuable information in locations like this one, places that others might overlook. Jin Yeomyung, still holding his nose, directed his gaze closely towards the area where a number of sick individuals were lying prone upon the floor. Moving confidently onwards, he let out a quiet sound and remarked that he had detected something unusual and noteworthy ahead of them. He also mentioned that he had felt the sensation of eyes watching him for a considerable period of time leading up to that moment. A figure could be seen gradually drawing nearer to the location of Jin Yeomyung and his companion. At that particular moment, however, only the figure's legs were visible, partially hidden from view by the presence of a building. Jin Yeomyung's companion turned her head to look, but Jin Yeomyung issued a warning to his companion, stating that if the unseen observers continued to watch them in this manner after they entered a building, he would not allow the matter to go unresolved. Suddenly, they entered an area that was densely populated with vibrant green plants bearing brightly colored red flowers in bloom. A clearly defined path cut across the middle of these thick and abundant plants, providing a route forward. Jin Yeomyung remarked narratively to his companion that there seemed to be an abundance of plant life in this particular area and inquired if it was possible that someone was actively cultivating and growing them. His companion confirmed that it indeed appeared to be the case, stating that it seemed so. Furthermore, his companion also commented that there was a certain appealing and attractive quality about this specific location, despite the surrounding squalor. Gently pulling the cloth away from her eyes, just slightly, and looking at the plants with a sense of fondness, she cautiously attempted to touch one of the plants with her hand. She commented that even though the individuals who were responsible for growing these plants had evidently been forced out of the cult's mainstream society, the act of cultivating these things probably provided them with some measure of comfort and a sense of calm amidst their difficulties. However, Jin Yeomyung raised his voice, shouting out to his companion and informing her that these particular plants were a type of substance known to be used by people to induce strange and altered effects, implying they were likely hallucinogenic or narcotic in nature. He emphatically stated that whoever was engaged in planting and growing them was most definitely not a simple or ordinary farmer. That much was absolutely certain. As Jin Yeomyung was conveying this important information, multiple figures approached closer to Jin Yeomyung and his companion and spoke out in rough, abrasive voices. They offered a greeting to the young people who had arrived in their area. They questioned whether the appearance of a group of young individuals in this location could possibly be a simple matter of chance. A man with a distinct mark upon his face and wearing clothing that appeared worn and poor in quality spoke down to Jin Yeomyung, instructing him that if he had no desire to sustain any physical injury, then he and his companion ought to leave the area promptly and without delay. Observing the scene unfolding before him, Jin Yeomyung considered silently to himself that with the exception of the man positioned in the center, who seemed to hold a position of some importance, the rest of the approaching figures were merely simple thugs or ruffians. He then stated his position out loud, declaring that leaving was not an option and would not be happening. He stated that his purpose in coming was specifically to meet Ma Jin-yoon, the individual who held the most important position of authority within this place. The scar-faced man lifted the heavy stick he held in his hand, a confident smile spreading across his features. He remarked that he had initially intended to allow them to depart peacefully, given that they appeared to be individuals of some importance from a cult, but it seemed that their actions were effectively inviting a physical confrontation. Saying that, he issued a direct order to his men, instructing them to attack and inflict significant injury, specifically mentioning breaking an arm or causing similar harm. His followers, eagerly obeying the command issued by their leader, rushed forward with various makeshift weapons in their hands, including sticks, sharp knives, and bladed instruments. They were all shouting loudly, their voices filled with excitement and agreement with their leader's directive. On the other side of the confrontation, Jin Yeomyung's companion stated that her specialized skill lay in preemptive strike tactics and strategic planning, and that she was not the type of person who engaged in direct physical combat. Jin Yeomyung reassured her, telling her not to be concerned, as he had not expected her to actively participate in the fighting. While they were engaging in this remarkably calm conversation amidst the escalating tension, the group of hostile individuals, screaming loudly that they would kill them at the top of their lungs, were rapidly drawing closer to Jin Yeomyung and his companion. Jin Yeomyung stood his ground, his hands calmly clasped behind his back. He stated that if he were to actually die in this location, then leaning forward slightly with a mocking look on his face, he conveyed to the scar-faced leader that the true trouble would then fall squarely upon the leader himself. The man with a face crisscrossed by fresh bruises and streaked with dirt moved haltingly forward, his steps uncertain as he guided Jin Yeomyung and his companion toward a large, imposing structure. The air surrounding them felt oppressively heavy, thick with the palpable tension and lingering effects of the recent skirmish. Jin Yeomyung maintained a composed presence, his companion staying closely by his side, her gaze diligently scanning their surroundings with a watchful intensity. As their small group drew nearer to the substantial building, a figure with white hair, appearing to be a man in his middle years, emerged from the entrance. He positioned himself just outside the doorway, his eyes settling upon the three weary individuals approaching. A slow, deliberate smile gradually spread across his face as he commented on the unexpected nature of their arrival, expressing a mild surprise at seeing them appear. He then shifted his attention to the battered form of Scarface, observing, in a tone that seemed perhaps too casual given the circumstances, that he had not anticipated Scarface bringing any guests along with him. Scarface, bearing the marks of a beating and clad in dirty, disheveled clothing, respectfully lowered his head in a gesture of deference, speaking with a voice that conveyed submission as he acknowledged his perceived mistake and offered an apology to the man he addressed as the third elder. The elder, his eyes reflecting the accumulation of many years of experience and marked by numerous lines etched across his forehead, directed his gaze specifically towards Jin Yeomyung. One of his hands was noticeably absent, the empty sleeve neatly tucked into his belt. He spoke with a voice that held a discernible degree of respect, conveying his honor at the opportunity to meet someone originating from one of the 6 noble clans. Jin Yeomyung responded with a light-hearted smile playing on his lips, confirming the elder's assumption about his noble origin and playfully suggesting that he would be willing to offer a generous reward, acting on behalf of his clan, if the elder could accurately identify precisely which of the 6 clans he belonged to. Upon hearing the mention of a potential reward, the elder appeared visibly startled. His body trembled slightly, and a peculiar expression of calculation flickered across his face. He seemed to be internally assessing the significant standing of the 6 clans, mentally associating them with considerable wealth and influence, as he carefully considered the possibilities that lay before him. After a brief moment spent in thoughtful deliberation, he offered his reasoned guess, inquiring whether Jin Yeomyung might perhaps be from the Hidden Shadow So clan. Jin Yeomyung reacted with a clear display of surprise upon hearing this particular suggestion. He promptly inquired what factors had led the middle-aged man to arrive at such a conclusion. The elder, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of politeness and thoughtfully stroking his white beard, proceeded to articulate his reasoning. He explained that if one were to trace their suppliers back through the intricate network of connections, they would eventually arrive at the Hwan clan. He further added that, based on historical knowledge, the Hidden Shadow So clan and the Hwan clan had maintained a challenging and often strained relationship that extended back for numerous generations. The elder had incorporated this long-standing tension between the 2 powerful clans as a key element in his deduction process. Moreover, he reasoned that because Scarface had clearly endured such a thorough and severe beating, it seemed more logical that the unexpected guest belonged to the Hwan clan, a group widely recognized for their immense power and therefore likely capable of inflicting such significant damage. A subtle hint of a smug expression touched Jin Yeomyung's face as he processed the elder's detailed explanation. He mused aloud, confirming that the powerful, indeed earth-shaking, Hwan clan had undeniably been involved with a group of ruffians he had recently encountered and dealt with. However, he then delivered a piece of information that proved quite surprising, stating that the elder's carefully considered guess was unfortunately incorrect. He then introduced himself by revealing his true name, stating clearly that his name was Jin Yeomyung. The middle-aged man was visibly taken aback and clearly astonished by this sudden revelation. He instinctively pointed an index finger towards Jin Yeomyung, his eyes widening significantly in astonishment and his mouth slightly dropping open in sheer surprise. He uttered a sharp gasp, immediately identifying Jin Yeomyung as originating from the demonic Heaven Jin clan, and not merely just any member, but specifically the highly regarded first young master. His gaze then naturally shifted to observe Jin Yeomyung's physical presence with renewed scrutiny. Jin Yeomyung's companion, her face displaying an expression of caution, spoke softly, her voice conveying a sense of concern. She questioned whether it had been a wise decision to reveal his true and important identity so openly in this situation, raising the potential concern that these individuals might possess connections to the suppliers of the black clotted blood, the very substance they were actively investigating. Jin Yeomyung dismissed her worries with a confident and assured reply. He stated plainly that if they simply used the considerable power and influence of his clan to decisively crush anyone involved in the matter, that would effectively bring the entire situation to a swift and conclusive end. The middle-aged man immediately lowered himself into a deep and respectful bow towards the young master of the prestigious Jin clan. Simultaneously, Scarface dropped swiftly to his knees on the ground in a similar display of deference. The elder offered polite greetings, expressing his genuine curiosity as to what circumstances could possibly bring a noble figure from the esteemed Jin family to a location such as this one. While outwardly engaging in these pleasantries, the elder's mind was racing internally, filled with a growing sense of trepidation at the mere thought of the black clotted blood and its alarming potential connection to this incredibly powerful guest now standing before him. Jin Yeomyung, maintaining his neutral but still slightly smug demeanor, proceeded to explain the purpose of his visit. He stated that he had received information suggesting that the source of the infamous drug was located here and that he desired to learn more detailed information about it. The middle-aged man hesitated visibly at this direct and pointed question. He began to speak, starting with a noticeable stutter in his voice, but then abruptly fell silent, clearly demonstrating a strong reluctance to elaborate further on the subject. Observing his evident hesitation, Jin Yeomyung produced a small, heavy bag filled with gold coins. He casually tossed it towards the elder, suggesting with a hint of amusement that perhaps this might serve as a helpful incentive to encourage him to speak more freely. The middle-aged man instinctively caught the bag, his body pushed slightly back by its unexpected weight. Upon opening it, his eyes widened significantly at the sight of the multitude of gleaming gold coins contained within. He exclaimed the word gold aloud, his typically serious demeanor momentarily forgotten in his sudden excitement and astonishment. Suddenly, all of his previous reluctance completely vanished. He began to speak rapidly and effusively, pouring out a torrent of information about the black clotted blood in a single, breathless stream. He explained that the drug originated from areas located outside their immediate vicinity and merely passed through their location during its transit, never actually coming into direct physical contact with their hands. He clarified that their own operational activities involved the production of different types of drugs, which they specifically supplied to the Huan clan. He stressed emphatically that they were not involved in distributing the black clotted blood to local areas within the city, such as the entertainment district or the various alleys. Jin Yeomyung was visibly taken aback by this entirely unexpected piece of information. He had consistently assumed that this very location served as the primary source and distribution point for the drug. He then pressed further, asking pointedly who, if not them, was directly responsible for distributing it within the region. The elder immediately began to name the specific group, identifying the tyrant wolf sect of Juliu as the main culprits responsible for the drug's distribution. Before he could provide any further details, another figure suddenly rushed rapidly towards the three individuals. This new arrival was noticeably missing a leg, but despite this significant physical handicap, the urgent nature of the situation clearly fueled his movement. He dashed forward on his single leg, shouting loudly that there was a serious problem and addressing the middle-aged man specifically as the third elder. Without acknowledging the presence of Jin Yeomyung or his companion, the new arrival continued to shout, identifying them as intruders who had entered their territory. Jin Yeomyung and his companion exchanged brief glances, silently wondering if the frantic man's warning was directed specifically at them. Meanwhile, in a different area, a distinctly different scene was simultaneously unfolding. Cheon Yura stood composedly amidst the fallen bodies of more than a dozen people, her blade visibly stained with blood. She slowly lifted her head, her gaze calmly sweeping across the scene of carnage before she deliberately turned her body. Elsewhere, a man lay sprawled unceremoniously on the ground. His legs were conspicuously hairy. Another man, one of the remaining thugs who had not yet been defeated, ran towards the fallen figure, calling out the titled team leader as he approached. He reported that the young cult leader seemed to have unexpectedly appeared in their midst. The man on the ground, the team leader, was dressed in shabby, disheveled clothes, giving him an unkempt and somewhat wild, almost barbaric appearance. This was Jin Yeomyung, the team leader of the Orthodox Path Alliance's spy squad, specifically the 17th team. Jin Yeomyung, still seated awkwardly on the ground, reached for his club with a determined hand. He then questioned the new arrival, asking pointedly if he had begun drinking alcohol early in the morning, implying his report was unbelievable. The man quickly denied this, assuring his leader with sincerity that he would never do such a thing. The subordinate then proceeded to recount the events he had personally witnessed in the district where Cheon Yura had been encountered. He described her swinging her sword with unrestrained force and devastating power, cutting down everyone who came near her, including approximately a dozen fighters from the venomous snail sect, in a single, swift, and brutal action. Hearing this shocking report, Jin Yeomyung was completely stunned and visibly shocked. He was clearly taken aback by the information, his dirty mouth falling open in disbelief and his eyes widening significantly in astonishment. He questioned whether it truly had been the young cult leader he was hearing about, suggesting that if it was not her, then she must be a major and incredibly powerful figure from one of the 6 great clans. Jin Yeomyung's mind immediately began to race, urgently attempting to identify this formidable female fighter. He muttered aloud to himself, considering which of the women from the 6 prominent clans possessed such might, explicitly excluding the young cult leader from his calculations. He thought of So Soyu from the influential So clan. Other potential candidates crossed his mind, including Sa Bayan of the respected Sa clan, or even the formidable twins from the Pa clan. Then, another thought suddenly occurred to him, his eyes focusing intently as he considered the possibility. He expressed his fervent hope that this formidable fighter was not, in fact, the very person they were currently targeting for capture or elimination. Looking down at his heavy club with a determined expression, Jin Yeomyung issued a command to his subordinate. He instructed him to quickly gather the kids, a term likely referring to their team members. The subordinate responded with immediate and enthusiastic affirmation, assuring his leader that he would call the members of the 17th Spy Squad right away as instructed. Jin Yeomyung, however, shouted back emphatically, telling the subordinate not to get overly excited or jump to conclusions. He clarified that he was not referring to their own team members, but rather someone else's group. The Killing Demons, who had been specifically dispatched from higher levels within the organization to ensure the smooth and uninterrupted supply of the black clotted blood. Jin Yeomyung stated emphatically that they needed to summon the specialized killer squad immediately. The scene then shifted back in time by a few minutes, rewinding to an earlier point in the narrative. Jin Yeomyung and his companion were making their way towards a valley that was rumored to be extensively filled with cannabis plants. A figure was hidden discreetly behind a wall nearby, observing their movements. At that very moment, another person was also present in the vicinity, whispering a warning to the taller hidden figure that they risked being discovered if they positioned themselves too closely to the approaching individuals. The hidden figure responded solemnly, quietly agreeing with the assessment of the potential danger. The hidden figure was, in fact, Cheon Yura from the powerful Cheon clan. She observed the vast area dedicated to the cultivation of cannabis with a questioning gaze and wondered aloud why her own cult had left such a place entirely untouched and undefended. Standing directly behind her were 2 attendants, forming a small group of 4 highly skilled swordswomen dedicated to her protection. The one positioned immediately behind Cheon Yura provided a detailed explanation. She stated that the plants were a necessary material required for a specific formation utilized by the Huan clan. Additionally, she explained the deliberate lack of strong defensive measures in this area was strategically intended to draw in external intruders, thereby making it significantly easier to identify and subsequently eliminate them. Without turning around to face her attendants, Cheon Yura calmly asked if Jin Yeomyung had possessed prior knowledge of this fact before he decided to come to this particular location. She then issued a clear command to her subordinates. They were to continue the pursuit, following Jin Yeomyung and his companion. Her immediate attendant expressed a degree of surprise upon hearing this specific instruction, clearly not expecting that particular order. Cheon Yura offered a sly and knowing explanation for her actions, stating that she desired to understand what motivations and thoughts were driving Jin Yeomyung's actions and decisions. A specific memory flickered momentarily in her mind. The surprising confession Jin Yeomyung had made to her during their intense duel at their engagement meeting. She vividly recalled him stating directly that he liked her. Still, leaning slightly to one side, she shared another thought, recounting how her father, her revered lordship, had told her that because she naturally possessed many potential enemies due to her position, it was critically important for her to be able to accurately distinguish true friends from potential foes. Cheon Yura's attendants smiled, their cheeks appearing slightly flushed with amusement and approval. They were clearly impressed by their young leader's dedication to diligently cultivating her qualities and strategic thinking as a future leader. One of them commented that the situation seemed rather entertaining to observe. However, Cheon Yura held a different perspective on the matter. A subtle smirk played on her lips, and a distinct grin touched her face as she tightly grasped her fist. She mused to herself that if a true recluse, a hidden master, genuinely existed, there was a significant chance that he might be found residing in a place such as this isolated valley. Her 3 attendants standing behind her were completely taken aback and clearly astonished by this sudden and unexpected thought. Without uttering another word, Cheon Yura moved forward swiftly and decisively. She expressed an intense desire to meet such a person, a hidden master, just once in her lifetime. Her attendants immediately attempted to dissuade her from her impulsive action, urgently warning her against being too rash and potentially leaping directly into danger without proper consideration. Their efforts proved entirely in vain, however, as Cheon Yura had already leaped forward, driven by her sudden impulse. Her attendants commented amongst themselves that such impulsive and sometimes reckless behavior seemed to be a common trait observed among the elders of the esteemed Cheon clan. Returning to the scene after the violent fight, Cheon Yura stood victorious over the fallen thugs, her blade still dripping blood. She began to think to herself, finding the entire situation quite strange and perplexing. Not only was there no recluse to be found in the area, but something else felt distinctly amiss. She pondered how Jin Yeomyung had managed to enter this heavily guarded area without encountering any significant resistance, while she herself had felt constantly hindered and blocked by someone or something during her approach. At this very moment, Jin Yeomyung had already realized that he was being followed by Cheon Yura. He mused internally that the persistent and lingering feeling of being watched had, in fact, been the young cult leader observing him all along. By this point in time, Jin Yeomyung had returned after his informative conversation with the middle-aged elder and had successfully gained valuable insight into the complex origin and movement of the black clotted blood drug. He then turned to his companion and suggested they proceed together towards Cheon Yura to join forces. Cheon Yura, moving forward herself, expressed her amazement and disbelief at the information she had received. She hadn't truly believed the elder's words initially, but now she found it almost incredible that he had been telling the absolute truth about the drug's distribution. As she was processing this thought, Jin Yeomyung looked sharply to his right and called out, announcing loudly that they were coming back again, indicating an approaching threat. By now, Jin Yeomyung had successfully caught up to the group that included both Cheon Yura and Jin Yeomyung. Jin Yeomyung directly addressed Cheon Yura, apologetically stating that she would regrettably have to become their prisoner. Cheon Yura looked at the approaching man with a challenging gaze and demanded to know his identity. Jin Yeomyung replied with a smug expression on his face, suggesting that such information was irrelevant and all she needed to do was comply and come along quietly without resistance. At this point, the small group that had been quietly accompanying Jin Yeomyung discreetly excused themselves from the situation. They had no desire whatsoever to become entangled in the dangerous conflict that was clearly about to erupt between Jin Yeomyung's formidable killer squad and the powerful figures standing before them. They quickly moved away, wisely distancing themselves from the impending confrontation that loomed large. Cheon Yura observed Jin Yeomyung closely and commented that he looked remarkably like a beggar from the beggar clan due to his disheveled appearance. Jin Yeomyung responded to her observation, suggesting they should perhaps spare the man's life, noting that he likely possessed a significant amount of valuable information that could be useful to their investigation. Jin Yeomyung added, in a slightly mocking tone, that it was quite surprising they had stumbled upon such a valuable lead so quickly and unexpectedly. Cheon Yura's fighters, now positioned defensively around her, identified Jin Yeomyung's accompanying group, specifically naming them as the Dark Shadow, Protective Shadow, and Fist Shadow, titles indicating their specialized roles within the organization. Cheon Yura turned back to one of her attendants, calling out specifically for Sa-Bayan to come forward and assist her. Sa-Bayan, lowering the veil that had covered her face to reveal her striking golden eyes, calmly acknowledged the command. She then issued her own precise orders to her fighters, the Dark Butterflies, instructing them to immediately come forward and protect young Master Jin Yeomyung at all costs. The three Dark Butterfly fighters immediately surrounded Jin Yeomyung, positioning themselves on three sides to create a protective shield around him. Jin Yeomyung was surprised not only by the sudden action of being encircled by these three highly skilled fighters, but also by the surprising revelation that the leader of the spy pavilion, a presumably high-ranking individual, was none other than Sa-Bayan herself. Jin Yeomyung, grinding his teeth in obvious frustration at the unexpected development, remarked disdainfully that it was a cute strategy employed by their opponents, but quickly pointed out that none of the protective escorts surrounding Cheon Yura appear to have reached the peak level of cultivation. He sharply contrasted this with his own side, boasting confidently that they possessed an exceptional master who had attained the peak cultivation level. Both sides then drew their swords simultaneously, pointing the sharp blades towards each other, creating a tense and precarious standoff that hung in the air. Cheon Yura broke the silence, noting calmly that Jin Yeomyung seemed to possess a considerable amount of knowledge concerning her cult's internal affairs. Jin Yeomyung responded with a loud, booming laugh, confirming her observation and stating emphatically that he was particularly well-informed when it came to matters specifically concerning the Cheon family. Hearing this direct and assertive declaration, Cheon Yura was momentarily taken aback and clearly surprised. She murmured softly to herself, repeating the phrase, Cheon family matters, as she processed the statement. At this precise point, a surge of intense anger welled up within Cheon Yura. She unleashed her powerful sword aura, a visible emanation of the darkest black and red energy, and shouted out to the opposing group, referring to them disdainfully as mere insects. The air crackled with a palpable tension as the imposing figure of Cheon Yura projected an aura of such immense power that it instantly paralyzed the group of waiting thugs. A wave of sheer terror washed over them, rendering them momentarily immobile and speechless. They stumbled back, their eyes wide with disbelief, murmuring panicked questions to one another about the nature of this overwhelming force and how this young woman could possibly possess a sword aura of such magnitude. Yet, their leader, Jin Yeomyung, a man hardened by countless skirmishes, allowed his terrified subordinates no time to succumb to their fear or contemplate the impossible situation. With a harsh, guttural roar that cut through the rising panic, he issued a single, brutal command, ordering his fighters to immediately launch their attack upon Cheon Yura. Cheon Yura stood firm, her sword pointed directly ahead, its tip gleaming menacingly, while the formidable energy of her aura swirled visibly around her, a tangible manifestation of her power. Her voice, though clear, carried a fierce intensity as she declared with absolute conviction that not a single individual among them would manage to leave the vast expanse of the 10,000 mountain alive. With that chilling promise delivered, she moved with breathtaking speed, transforming from a static figure of power into a dynamic force of destruction. Her sword became a blur as she slashed through the ranks of the charging thugs, cutting down one after another with brutal efficiency. The sounds of battle were punctuated by the sharp cries of pain from the fighters struck by Cheon Yura's blade, their bodies collapsing to the ground as blood splattered across the earth. One desperate individual attempted to land a blow on her, swinging his weapon with all his might, but Cheon Yura moved with an almost supernatural swiftness, effortlessly stepping aside to avoid the strike, her movements fluid and precise. A faint, contemptuous smile touched her lips as she swung her sword once more, felling another of their number, and she repeated her earlier, dismissive remark, likening them to mere insects utterly beneath her notice. In the span of only a few fleeting moments, the vast majority of the thugs' fighters lay dead or incapacitated on the ground. Among the few who remained, one man made a desperate attempt to push himself up from the blood-soaked earth, but the fear that gripped him was so profound and overwhelming that his entire body trembled uncontrollably, making it impossible for him to even muster the strength to stand. At the same time, Cheon Yura's own contingent of skilled fighters advanced, moving with disciplined purpose to efficiently engage and eliminate any of the remaining opponents who still posed a threat. It was at that very instant, amidst the waning chaos, that another man, kneeling on the ground with his long, heavy axe resting beside him, seemed to convey a gesture of surrender, indicating his wish for the brutal confrontation to simply end there. Jin Yeomyung, witnessing the utter and irreversible collapse of his forces in a matter of seconds, found himself unable to process the staggering defeat he had just endured. His face contorted into a grimace of pure, unadulterated rage, and he gritted his teeth tightly in frustration. He turned his furious gaze towards Jin Yeomyung, his voice rough with anger, and vowed that he would, at the very least, ensure Jin Yeomyung's demise. Uttering Jin Yeomyung's name like a curse, Jin Yeomyung charged forward with reckless abandon, his heavy axe raised high behind him, his eyes wide and burning with murderous intent focused solely on his target. Jin Yeomyung, remarkably, appeared completely unharmed and displayed no outward signs of fear or apprehension in the face of the charging Jin Yeomyung. A slight, almost imperceptible grin played upon his lips as he considered Giant Myongyi's rashness, particularly given the presence of several highly capable and powerful individuals surrounding Jin Yeomyung at that very moment. However, in the blink of an eye, and without any apparent warning, all three of Jin Yeomyung's personal protective guards abruptly shifted their positions, moving away from him in a coordinated action. This sudden and unexpected withdrawal by his guards took Jin Yeomyung entirely by surprise. He was left momentarily exposed, without any immediate line of defense, and for a brief instant, he hesitated, unsure of how best to react to this unforeseen development. As he watched Giant Myongyi charging directly towards him, Jin Yeomyung quickly assessed the imminent situation. He could clearly discern that Giant Myongyi, despite having likely passed his physical prime, still retained the formidable capabilities of a seasoned expert. Gritting his teeth in a moment of intense focus, Jin Yeomyung realized that it was already far too late to attempt to evade the incoming strike from Giant Myongyi's heavy axe. In the final desperate fraction of a second, he instinctively drew his own sword from its scabbard and managed to bring it up just in time to intercept the powerful, descending attack. The force of the impact was nothing short of tremendous. The sheer power behind Giant Myongyi's blow sent Jin Yeomyung reeling backward with significant momentum, causing him to be propelled across the ground, tumbling for a considerable distance before finally coming to a stop. As he rolled uncontrollably, a single, somewhat self-deprecating thought flashed through his mind. He had been aiming to maintain a cool and collected appearance, and now he found himself sprawled ignominiously on the dirt. Cheon Yura's accompanying fighters viewed the event from a completely different perspective. They were utterly stunned that Jin Yeomyung had somehow managed to block the powerful blow at all. One of them exclaimed aloud in a tone of sheer disbelief, questioning how it could possibly have happened, given the incredibly brief window of time he had been afforded to react, that he had succeeded in not only drawing his sword, but also in defending himself effectively against such a devastating attack. At that precise moment, Cheon Yura pressed her lips together tightly, a visible sign of her annoyance, and quietly muttered a curse under her breath. Giant Myongyi, the man who had delivered the powerful blow, was equally, if not more, shocked than the bystanders. He stood frozen for a moment, staring down at Jin Yeomyung lying on the ground, and questioned aloud, in a tone of bewildered confusion, why Jin Yeomyung was not dead. Jin Yeomyung, still positioned on the ground, lifted a finger and pointed it directly at Giant Myongyi, shouting back that he was a crazy psycho, and that people simply did not say things like that under any normal circumstances. Giant Myongyi, however, seemed genuinely unable to fully comprehend the situation unfolding before him. He had been absolutely certain in his own mind that his strike should have cleaved through Jin Yeomyung's skull and resulted in instant death. Unable to reconcile the outcome with his expectation, he was left standing in bewildered, stunned silence. Cheon Yura did not allow this moment of stunned inaction to pass unnoticed. Seizing the opportunity presented by Giant Myongyi's paralysis, she moved from behind him with a single, incredibly swift motion of her sword. With a clean and decisive strike, she efficiently separated Giant Myongyi's head from his body. As she executed the fatal blow, she spoke calmly to Jin Yeomyung, stating that, just as she had anticipated, his demonstrated level of skill was indeed more than sufficient to endure such a powerful attack. Jin Yeomyung was visibly surprised by Cheon Yura's comment, exclaiming aloud in sudden realization that her earlier actions and the entire situation had been a deliberate test of his capabilities all along. He then called out to Cheon Yura, asking if she was now satisfied that she had successfully confirmed his skill. Cheon Yura, in the process of smoothly sliding her sword back into its scabbard, replied that she was, in fact, very much satisfied with what she had witnessed. Following this exchange, Jin Yeomyung indulged in a silent internal monologue. He acknowledged that individuals in positions of higher authority frequently subjected others to such tests as a matter of course. But he still found himself feeling a considerable degree of frustration over the ordeal, silently cursing the damn heavenly demon divine cult, with what felt like a stinging sensation in his eyes. With the immediate conflict concluded, Cheon Yura and her team were able to secure and capture one of the surviving leaders among the thugs, a man identified as Bun Myongyi. Bun Myongyi cried out in abject despair upon his capture, pleading with his captors to to simply grant him the mercy of death. He was kneeling on the ground with two swords held threateningly against his neck when Jin Yeomyung approached him. Jin Yeomyung calmly questioned his desperate plea to be killed, pointing out that Bun Myonggi was now in a position to provide extremely valuable testimony concerning the matter of the black clotted blood. Bun Myonggi made a clear attempt to evade Jin Yeomyung's probing question. Sweat beaded noticeably on his forehead as he nervously looked away and stuttered, claiming complete ignorance about any substance referred to as black spot blood. Jin Yeomyung's eyes narrowed sharply at this obvious deception, his anger clearly rising. He raised his voice, shouting at Bun Myonggi that he could claim whatever he wished, but perhaps this denial simply confirmed that he was, in truth, a part of the demonic cult after all. With that chilling declaration, Jin Yeomyung began to make preparations for a more forceful method of interrogation. He deliberately pulled up the sleeves of his garment, stating that while he might have been somewhat lackadaisical in his formal martial arts training, there were a few specific skills he had been highly motivated to learn and practice thoroughly. This statement, delivered with an unsettling calm, clearly sent a ripple of surprise through Bun Myonggi. Fear was now intensely evident in Bun Myonggi's eyes as he looked up at Jin Yeomyung's approaching figure. Jin Yeomyung continued speaking, specifying with chilling precision that he had practiced the technique known as the tendon-ripping bone lock with exceptional thoroughness. Bun Myonggi, desperate to find any way to escape the horrific situation he was facing, hesitantly asked him to wait, his voice trembling. However, Jin Yeomyung completely disregarded his plea. A brilliant, almost joyful smile spread across Jin Yeomyung's face as he told Bun Myonggi, with an unervingly pleasant tone, to please remain silent and still. He added that this would be his very first time performing such a technique for real, and he intended to enjoy the experience just a little. With a quick, cheerful snap of his fingers, he suggested, in a bright voice, that they begin, promising to start off nice and easy. In a separate scene, Cheon Yura was observed gracefully brushing a small amount of dust from her elegant dress, her composure fully restored after the recent conflict. She casually addressed Sa Bayan, expressing her apologies for having involved her unnecessarily in the dangerous situation. Sa Bayan responded with understanding, noting that it was perfectly acceptable, especially since young Master Jin Yeomyung had seemingly accepted her apology, although she added with a slight smile that there had been a bit of an aftertaste involved. Sa Bayan then recalled a brief conversation she had shared with Jin Yeomyung earlier. She had intended to formally apologize to him regarding the nature of the test of his strength, but when she had approached him, Jin Yeomyung had simply brushed her off with a casual air, referring to her by the rather distinct moniker Miss Black Flying Seventh Tiger. Returning to the present moment, Sa Bayan posed a thoughtful question to Cheon Yura. She inquired what Cheon Yura would have done if young Master Jin Yeomyung had managed to pass her deliberate test completely and unequivocally. Cheon Yura looked away for a moment before formulating her response. She stated that if he had indeed met her full expectations, she supposed she might have considered pursuing one of the significant dreams she had long ago given up on. As she uttered these words, her gaze subtly shifted, resting for a brief moment on Jin Yeomyung's back in the distance, where he was still engaged in his task. Meanwhile, Jin Yeomyung remained fully occupied with his interrogation of Bun Myonggi. He understood with complete certainty that Bun Myonggi, now utterly stripped of any means to resist or escape, had absolutely no alternative but to divulge every piece of information he possessed. Bun Myonggi continued to plead desperately with Jin Yeomyung to cease whatever painful actions he was intending to perform, promising repeatedly that he would tell him absolutely everything he knew. However, Jin Yeomyung remained completely unfazed by the pleas, casually humming a tune and telling Bun Myonggi, with an unsettling lack of urgency, to just hold on for a little while longer. Observing this scene from a distance, Cheon Yura commented quietly, indicating that she now understood that Jin Yeomyung's underlying motivation for his actions was not simply driven by something as straightforward as romantic interest in a woman. After concluding his business with Bun Myonggi and extracting the necessary information, Jin Yeomyung returned to where Cheon Yura and Sa Bayan were waiting. He shared the details he had managed to obtain from the captured thug. He confirmed that the now-deceased Jin Myonggi was indeed affiliated with the Beggars Gang. He added that Jin Myonggi's superior within the gang had apparently formed some sort of partnership with an individual from the Cheon clan, although even Jin Yeomyung had not known the specific identity of this person. Hearing this disturbing piece of information, Cheon was visibly shocked, exclaiming aloud that the Cheon clan was apparently connected to the insidious drug case. Jin Yeomyung continued to relay the intelligence he had gathered. He stated that the men Bun Myongi had brought with him for the ambush were from an organization known as the Hidden Trace Manor, located within the region of Giryu Fortress. Sa Baiyin had a sudden realization. She remembered distinctly that the third elder had also made mention of Giryu Fortress in a previous discussion. She then provided additional, pertinent information, stating that the Hidden Trace Manor was a faction that had been founded some 50 years prior by a retired member of the notorious Ghost Slayer unit. Surprised by this revelation, Cheon Yura looked directly at Sa Baiyin and exclaimed aloud, "Ghost Slayer." Jin Yeomyung added to the developing conversation, noting that this was the very same unit Gu Cheol used to be a part of. Sa Baiyin confirmed this detail, further explaining that the Ghost Slayer had been the Cheon clan's elite assassination unit, which had since been officially disbanded. At this point, Jin Yeomyung addressed Cheon Yura directly, his tone conveying a clear sense of concern. He suggested it would be best if she made arrangements to return immediately. He explained that ever since the unexpected ambush, the situation had rapidly escalated and grown far beyond what they could effectively handle on their own. Given the way these clandestine groups typically operated in isolated, self-contained cells, he added, the Hidden Trace Manor was likely not even their main base of operations. He then gestured towards Bun Myongi, who still lay trembling on the ground, stating that if the enemy lost contact with their operatives who had been compromised, they would inevitably move quickly to erase all traces of their activities and simply vanish without a trace. Sa Baiyin then inquired of Jin Yeomyung what his own plans were in light of these new developments. Jin Yeomyung replied that a few unforeseen and complicating factors had indeed arisen, but he would simply begin his investigation anew, starting with a focus on the lower sect, specifically meaning the Tyrant Wolf sect he had learned about earlier in his inquiries. Cheon Yura unexpectedly interrupted the conversation flowing between Jin Yeomyung and Sa Baiyin. Pressing her lips together tightly in a determined line, she asserted that there was, in fact, a demonstrably better way to handle the increasingly complex situation. Moving her hands forward slightly, as if physically outlining her strategic approach, Cheon Yura explained that the core problem was that neither the official law enforcement court nor any other formal body possessed the necessary time or readily available resources to assemble a full-scale force for an immediate and decisive assault on the enemy's likely strongholds. Jin Yeomyung confirmed that her understanding of the limitations of the official organizations was correct. Cheon Yura then declared, with unwavering resolve, that she would go to them herself. She reasoned that if she made an official, high-profile visit as the young leader of the powerful cult, the enemy would find it impossible to engage in anything remotely suspicious so openly or attempt to hide their illicit activities effectively. Hearing this bold and potentially dangerous plan, Jin Yeomyung appeared visibly confused and deeply concerned for Cheon Yura's safety. He immediately protested, saying he could not possibly allow her to risk her valuable life on something like this, emphasizing the potential peril. Cheon Yura, clenching her fingers into a tight fist, replied with an edge of anger in her voice, asking if he truly believed the gravity of the situation was merely nothing. Jin Yeomyung, looking down at the ground for a moment, spoke softly, stating that when compared to the immense and irreplaceable value of her life, yes, from his perspective, it was indeed nothing. Realizing the depth and sincerity of Jin Yeomyung's genuine concern for her well-being, Cheon Yura took a small step backward. A look of sadness and regret softened her features. She quietly admitted that because of her earlier, impulsive intervention, his original, more carefully laid plan had been unavoidably thrown off course. If she hadn't stepped in and initiated the fighting, the initial confrontation wouldn't have occurred, and the perpetrators might have been caught red-handed using the very clues and leads Jin Yeomyung had meticulously gathered. But now that the immediate offenders at the ambush site were dead or captured, the main culprits behind the scheme would most likely make every effort to cover their tracks and disappear. Cheon Yura added, her voice earnest, that she genuinely wished to make amends for the disruption she had inadvertently caused. Looking at Cheon Yura's sincere expression and the vulnerability she displayed, a genuine smile slowly formed on Jin Yeomyung's face. He thought to himself that this moment This display of honesty and concern was precisely one of the key reasons he had found himself falling for her. The scene then shifted, moving away from the immediate aftermath of the battle and transitioning to the outer edges of the vast 10,000 Mountains region. This area presented a stark and noticeable contrast to the wilder, more undeveloped inner regions they had just left. Here, there was evidence of a large and established settlement, with numerous trees scattered throughout the landscape and many houses dotted across the terrain, indicating a significant human presence. At the formal entrance to these outer edges stood a massive building, imposing in its size and flanked by equally imposing gates. Cheon Yura strode purposefully up to these formidable gates and, with a display of surprising strength, kicked them open forcefully, the heavy structures groaning in protest. Inside the entrance area, an elderly man with a short, neat mustache turned around sharply, his eyes widening instantly in shock as he loudly exclaimed that the young cult leader had arrived. This elderly man was identified as the third master of the Hidden Trace Manor. The third master looked at Cheon Yura and the guards accompanying her, a thought flashing rapidly through his mind. He had been on the very verge of ordering the complete withdrawal of their forces following the chaotic and unexpected situation in the Hidden Tear Valley, and now, almost unbelievably, their primary kidnapping target had arrived directly at their doorstep. The shrewd and cunning third elder, a man known for his ability to adapt quickly, immediately composed himself, regaining his outward composure. He cupped his hands together in a traditional gesture of deep respect and bowed his head deferentially. He offered a formal welcome to the young leader of the Cheon clan and inquired, with a polite air, about the great honor of her unexpected visit to their humble abode. Cheon Yura looked directly into the eyes of the third elder and spoke, pointedly bringing up his grandfather's past service within the ranks of the formidable demon Empress's Ghost Slayer unit. She stated that she had recently realized she had been neglecting those who had served the Cheon clan faithfully in the past, and felt it was now an appropriate time to rectify that oversight by personally visiting them. This explanation, however, was merely a carefully fabricated excuse that Cheon Yura had devised for the occasion. Moving forward purposefully towards the entrance of the building, she further commented that they all seemed to be quite busy with various activities. As she stepped across the threshold and entered inside, the people around her watched her movements cautiously and with a palpable sense of unease. It was clearly evident from their guarded demeanor and the atmosphere within the compound that something highly unusual was actively happening in this place. Cheon Yura noted, with a keen eye, that it appeared as if they were in the process of packing up in a considerable hurry. She then pointedly asked if they weren't planning to offer their distinguished guest a simple cup of tea as a matter of hospitality. As Cheon Yura ventured further inside, she could see a great deal of frantic activity unfolding around her. People were rushing about with a clear sense of urgency, carrying various items and supplies, obviously in a state of hurried preparation. The third elder, maintaining his facade of respectful posture, gestured towards a designated seating area, stating that within the territory of the 10,000 Mountains, the young cult leader was never considered merely a guest, but rather held a position of significant authority. Having delivered this statement, he formally invited her to enter fully, offering to personally guide her to the seating area. Simultaneously, a strange and unseen person was concealed discreetly behind the solid walls of the building. He whispered cryptically, asking the individual he addressed as the assassination master what specific course of action they should take now that their unexpected visitor had arrived. The third elder responded quietly to the hidden man, stating that since they had been presented with this unexpected second opportunity, they absolutely must capture her alive this time, emphasizing the crucial nature of the revised objective. The man hiding in the shadows confirmed that he understood and would carry out the order. Meanwhile, Cheon Yura, keenly observing everything happening around her with a sharp and discerning eye, commented casually to the third elder that, judging by the noticeable wear and tear of the place, it must receive quite a significant number of visitors on a regular basis, implying its frequent use for perhaps less than legitimate purposes. The third elder let out a hearty, somewhat forced laugh before beginning to speak again, attempting to deflect the underlying accusation. Since Cheon Yura had rapidly and accurately assessed the entire situation unfolding before her eyes, she understood without any doubt that these individuals were definitely involved in the illicit black clotted blood incident. Discarding all pretense of politeness or courtesy, she spoke directly and angrily, telling him in a sharp tone that he needed to use proper honorifics when addressing her and boldly calling him an arrogant and disrespectful individual. At this abrupt shift in tone and direct insult, Cheon Yura's 3 accompanying guards were immediately ready to draw their weapons and defend their leader. Suddenly, the distinct silhouettes of 4 additional figures appeared swiftly and silently in front of the third elder, positioning themselves protectively. The third elder laughed mockingly at Cheon Yura's outburst, stating that they both knew the true reality of the situation, and there was no longer any need for either of them to continue pretending otherwise. In the subsequent scene, the third elder and Cheon Yura faced each other directly, surrounded by a significant number of warriors from both sides. Blades were drawn and pointed menacingly, creating a tense and dangerous standoff. The third elder, raising his hand as a gesture of authority, told Cheon Yura that if she surrendered quietly without further resistance, he would not be forced to resort to using violent force against her. Cheon Yura responded calmly, but firmly by stating that she now clearly understood his true level of power and capability. The cunning old man, displaying a mocking grin and an expression of undeniable excitement, seemed unable to fully contain his exhilaration at the confrontation, so much so that his small beard appeared to flatten slightly against his chin. He taunted Cheon Yura, suggesting with clear condescension that merely catching one member of a life-slaying unit seemed to have led her to believe she was completely unstoppable. He issued a stern warning, cautioning her not to assume that this current display represented the full extent of his power or the preparations he had made. Cheon Yura looked upwards, a hint of shock and sudden weariness entering her eyes, as she abruptly realized with a sinking feeling that she had, in fact, been successfully captured within a complex and sophisticated mechanical formation technique that had been subtly laid to trap her. The intricate mechanical formation, a complex network of interlocking components and glowing energy lines, awakened with a low hum around Cheon Yura, its structure solidifying with unnerving speed. In an instant, she found herself completely enclosed within its confines, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. A cascading wave of intense surprise, followed swiftly by chilling shock and a cold tendril of fear, washed over her consciousness as her eyes frantically scanned the incredibly detailed and purposeful design that now held her captive. The third elder observed her reaction with a cold, calculated gaze, a low, mocking sound escaping his throat as he proceeded to explain that this elaborate construct was, in fact, a mage-pursuing killing formation specifically designed for eliminating powerful practitioners. His voice dripped with contempt as he implied with a cruel sneer that he had certainly not guided them into this perilous location without meticulous planning and thorough preparation beforehand. Encircling him, the blades held by the elder's contingent of fighters began to radiate a dark, malevolent energy, casting ominous shadows across the confined space, and they too joined in with harsh, cruel laughter directed at Cheon Yura's vulnerable, trapped state. However, amidst the rising tide of turmoil and the oppressive atmosphere, Cheon Yura's thoughts began to swiftly pivot and race in an entirely different direction, moving away from the immediate threat towards a deeper analysis of the situation. She found herself contemplating the truly immense expenditure, both in terms of vast wealth and significant manpower, that would have been absolutely necessary to establish a formation on such an enormous scale and simultaneously sustain the numerous, varied activities currently taking place within the sprawling pavilion complex. As her gaze settled intently upon the figure of the third elder, a clear and decisive conclusion formed in her mind. This elaborate operation, this level of logistical and financial commitment, was clearly not something that a mere retired assassin, even one with his past connections, could possibly orchestrate or manage effectively on his own. Without allowing even a single moment of hesitation to take root, Cheon Yura's hand moved with practiced speed, and her sword was drawn from its sheath in a fluid motion. She directed her voice towards the third elder, her tone firm despite the circumstances, indicating that there were indeed a great many crucial matters she would require extensive discussion with him about in the days to come. Yet, she stressed, before any of that could occur, she possessed a single, overwhelmingly pressing question that demanded an immediate answer. Holding her sword steady before her, its point unwavering, and with her three unquestionably loyal confidant warriors standing like immovable stones firmly at her back, their gazes fixed and determined, Cheon Yura directly posed her question to the third elder, demanding to know if he still remained a faithful servant of the Cheon clan, bound by duty and honor, or if he was, in fact, the treacherous individual who had secretly forged alliances and joined forces with dangerous outside powers against their own people. Completely disregarding her urgent question, the third elder's eyes suddenly became alight with a terrifying, mad intensity, a flicker of uncontrolled rage and desperation. He issued a sharp, barking command, his voice cutting through the tension, ordering his waiting fighters to immediately eliminate everyone present within the formation. Upon hearing his unequivocal order, his assembled fighters surged forward instantly, their movements possessing a surprising and unsettling speed that spoke of rigorous training and a ruthless mindset. On Cheon Yura's side, she also surged forward without the slightest delay, her own voice ringing out with cold certainty as she declared that she now possessed the answer she sought, the third elder's actions having revealed his true allegiance. In the intense, rapidly unfolding moments that followed the initiation of hostilities, a dozen shimmering sword auras, each radiating potent energy, converged and gathered protectively around Cheon Yura, forming a dazzling, lethal display. Her physical sword met the incoming blade of an opponent with a violent impact, causing a significant and explosive burst of aura to erupt outwards from the point of contact, a visible manifestation of the clashing internal energies. However, demonstrating remarkable skill and efficiency, Cheon Yura and her loyal companions, acting in perfect coordination, managed to overcome and defeat all of their immediate attackers within a remarkably short span of time, their movements a blur of deadly precision. Standing amidst the fallen foes, her sword now slick with the dark, gleaming substance of blood, crimson streaks running relentlessly down its sharp tip, Cheon Yura spoke softly, almost reflectively, to herself. She felt a profound sense that she still had a significant distance to traverse on her path to true mastery, acknowledging with a quiet sigh a lingering sense of internal hesitation and a perceived lack of fluidity that had, perhaps surprisingly, made the challenging task of dealing with opponents of this caliber feel more like a strenuous, demanding effort than a seamless execution. She then slowly turned her piercing gaze towards the third elder, her voice rising slightly now, a clear note of frustration entering her tone as she expressed her annoyance at finding herself covered in the blood spilled by what she clearly considered such insignificant and ultimately pathetic foes. With a single, sharp, decisive thrust of her sword, a swift, clean motion through the air, she efficiently cleansed the clinging blood from the polished steel of her blade. At that very same instant, the third elder stood utterly frozen, a look of profound shock etched across his features, the devastating realization dawning upon him that his carefully selected fighters had been vanquished with such alarming ease by Cheon Yura and her small group. Cheon Yura looked back at him, a cold, unsettling smile beginning to play faintly upon her lips, and her voice carried a sharp edge of bitterness as she wondered aloud, her words heavy with implication. If individuals like him, with their hidden agendas and treacherous actions, with a fundamental reason she had endured such profound suffering and hardship at the hands of another unknown party. The very tip of her sword began to glow with an intensifying light, beaming with her concentrated sword aura, a clear display of focused power. She continued her line of questioning, asking rhetorically if the endeavor of attempting to forcibly extract loyalty, or perhaps simply truth, from his stubborn tongue would ultimately prove to be a worthwhile and productive effort. Witnessing the potent and undeniable power emanating from Cheon Yura's glowing blade, the third elder experienced a surge of both intense surprise and a deep, unsettling wave of unease. A quiet, almost panicked thought flashed through his mind, barely registered before being dismissed. Sword key acupoint locking? He understood, with a sudden clarity that chilled him, her implicit intention. She clearly planned to immobilize and interrogate him, to extract information by force if necessary. He immediately rejected the very idea with a loud, desperate shout, vehemently calling it absolute nonsense, a foolish notion. He began to speak again, intending to loudly reveal the true identity of the individual who had been responsible for the ruin and destruction of the once loyal Ghost Slayer unit within their Cheon clan, a unit he had perhaps once commanded or held dear. But before he could complete his potentially damning statement, a sudden, unexpected attack materialized from behind Cheon Yura, a swift, unseen force. Someone cried out sharply in pain. The sound of impact was followed by the sickening splatter of blood, and an urgent voice, filled with alarm and desperation, immediately called out a frantic warning to Cheon Yura, imploring the young cult leader to exercise extreme caution and be aware of the unseen danger. Stunned and caught completely off guard by the sudden, unexpected attack that had come from an unforeseen direction, and momentarily unable to fully process or grasp the meaning of the frantic warning that had just been shouted, Cheon Yura's expression was one of pure, unadulterated surprise. She quickly spun around, her reflexes honed by countless battles, her eyes searching frantically for the source of the danger, only to see a figure now hovering ominously above her, positioned and poised to deliver a devastating strike. The newcomer, his eyes appearing eerily blank, devoid of emotion or recognition, raised his sword high above his shoulders in a threatening arc and brought it slicing downwards with incredible speed and force directly towards Cheon Yura. At the very last, critical second, summoning every ounce of her skill and strength, Cheon Yura managed to execute a desperate parry, deflecting the incoming blow. But the sheer, overwhelming force of the attack shocked her to her core, causing her to exclaim aloud in surprise, a raw, visceral reaction as she recognized the attacker for what he was, a true master of martial arts. The attacker, his face partially obscured, displayed a chilling, almost mechanical grin on his face, a silent acknowledgement of his superior power. The third elder, witnessing the timely arrival of the newly appeared individual, acknowledged their presence with a surprisingly respectful tone, a clear indication of a newcomer status, referring to them simply as Sir. The new enemy then moved with startling, almost inhuman speed, blurring past Cheon Yura in a display of terrifying agility, leaving her momentarily breathless and surprised once more by his effortless movement. With a look of dawning fear spreading across her face, she turned her gaze back towards the third elder, marveling silently to herself that this individual had passed her defensive perimeter so easily, as if she were not even there. The third elder at this point appeared visibly joyful and undeniably elated at the arrival of this formidable new fighter, his previous fear replaced by triumphant glee. He excitedly called out, his voice ringing with recognition, identifying the newcomer by some unknown designation. With a wicked, malevolent grin, he stressed the absolute and critical importance of not letting this golden opportunity slip away now that the woman, Cheon Yura, was definitively caught within the restrictive confines of the killing formation. However, before the third elder could even fully complete his gleeful statement, the new enemy moved again, this time with brutal and chilling efficiency. With a single, swift, decisive movement, he executed a clean and swift decapitation, the third elder's head separating from his body in a horrifying spectacle. The new enemy then stated, his voice cold and devoid of emotion, that it was only fitting and proper to dispose of a servant who had so clearly failed to successfully complete the task they had been assigned, indicating the third elder's demise was a consequence of his incompetence. The third elder's severed head bounced across the ground, coming to rest with a disturbing thud, a grim testament to the newcomer's ruthless nature. Cheon Yura looked intently at the new enemy, her initial shock giving way to a resurfacing curiosity, indicating that her intrigue regarding his true affiliation was growing significantly with every passing moment and every unexpected action. She extended an offer, proposing to utilize her own considerable wealth and make information known throughout the entire Central Plains, the vast network of martial artists and powers, if he would simply reveal his identity and purpose honestly and without deception. The new enemy, seemingly uninterested in her offer of notoriety or information dissemination through conventional means, simply looked downwards for a moment before turning away dismissively, commenting dryly that he supposed he could always put in a formal request at the beggar clan, a veiled but clear implication that his services, perhaps specifically in the realm of providing valuable information, possessed a significant, tangible price that needed to be met. Meanwhile, Cheon Yura's injured fighters, battered and bruised from the brief but intense engagement, some of them nursing bleeding wounds on their hands, exchanged uncertain and worried glances amongst themselves. One of them, her brow furrowed in pain, pressing firmly on her wounded hand to stem the persistent flow of blood, voiced her doubt aloud, wondering if this mysterious newcomer would truly reveal anything of substance, and urgently warning Cheon Yura that the newcomer was clearly a person of immense danger. Cheon Yura, however, met their concern with a slight, knowing, almost mocking grin, looking directly at her loyal companions, assuring them with quiet confidence that she was, in fact, acutely aware of the inherent danger he represented. That, she calmly explained, was precisely the core reason why her curiosity was so piqued and intense. She found herself wondering, with a growing sense of anticipation, about the true extent of her own personal strength and capabilities when directly compared to a master of such caliber, one who could so effortlessly utilize enhanced sword chi, a level of power currently beyond her immediate grasp. Turning his gaze fully towards Cheon Yura once more, the new enemy's eyes still held a dangerous, piercing glare, a silent testament to his power and intent. He remarked, his voice measured and deliberate, that the information regarding the young cult leader of the formidable demonic cult willingly putting her life on the line in such a perilous situation would undoubtedly command a very high price indeed in the marketplace of secrets and power. Cheon Yura responded to his observation with a smirk, a wide, confident grin spreading slowly across her face, stating that his assessment of the situation, his belief in the value of the information, was what he perceived as confidence, hinting perhaps at a deeper truth yet to be revealed. Suddenly, without any further warning or preamble, both Cheon Yura and the new enemy surged forward simultaneously, charging directly towards each other across the space of the formation. The new enemy spoke a final brief comment just moments before their impending collision, correcting her previous statement by saying it was not merely confidence he displayed, but rather something more akin to outright arrogance, condescendingly labeling her a foolish novice in the grand scheme of martial prowess. Their swords met with an explosive, thunderous force, the impact generating a shock wave of energy and sending brilliant sparks flying outwards in all directions around them. Cheon Yura gritted her teeth against the sheer power of the clash, anger flashing in her eyes, fueled by a fierce determination to somehow subdue and overcome this formidable new enemy who had appeared so unexpectedly. Their blades met repeatedly in a dizzying flurry of strikes and parries, each collision generating increasingly powerful bursts of energy, the very air around them crackling with the intensity of their exchange. The new enemy, his face still partially concealed by a veil that obscured his features, sounded genuinely excited, his voice tinged with surprise that she had managed to endure their initial exchange of blows without being immediately overwhelmed. At this critical juncture in the fierce battle, both Cheon Yura and the new enemy were forcefully pushed back by the sheer power of their latest collision, momentarily creating a space between them. Cheon Yura stumbled backward a few steps, regaining her balance, and stated, perhaps as much to herself as to her opponent, that the heavenly, demonic divine art, her core cultivation technique, was certainly not inferior to any other cultivation method, at least not when judged solely on the basis of raw, unadulterated power output. However, a different, more unsettling thought was beginning to race through the complex depths of Cheon Yura's mind now. Her previous outward display of confidence, so evident just moments before, had clearly begun to waver, replaced by a subtle flicker of fear that crossed her face, a momentary crack in her composure. She added softly, almost hesitantly, a new question entering her voice, questioning whether that equality in power held true even when confronted with a significant difference in fundamental cultivation levels, acknowledging the potential gap between them. The new enemy simply agreed with her unspoken concern, his single word confirming her fear. Without any further discussion or exchange of words, the new enemy charged at Cheon Yura once again, unleashing a blindingly rapid barrage of sword strikes, a relentless storm of steel aimed directly at her. Cheon Yura, utilizing her exceptional agility and trained reflexes, managed to skillfully dodge and evade the majority of the incoming blows, her movements a desperate dance of survival. The new enemy continued to press his advantage, speaking as he attacked, declaring with cold certainty that sheer talent alone, while valuable, was simply not sufficient to overcome the vast chasm between them. Despite her strenuous efforts to evade, one of his precisely aimed strikes managed to graze Cheon Yura's chest, a sharp, painful impact. She gritted her teeth against the sudden agony, her eyes once again filled with a burning anger as she desperately tried to twist and turn, evading his subsequent, relentless attacks. The new enemy pressed his point home, his voice devoid of sympathy, stating matter-of-factly that the significant gap in accumulated experience between them could not be easily closed by mere youthful potential or raw talent. With even more unbridled excitement, now clearly showing in his eyes and a wide, unnerving grin fully visible beneath his veil, he lunged at Cheon Yura with renewed ferocity. Their swords met once more, resulting in an even more massive and explosive burst of energy than before, a shockwave that reverberated through the formation. This time, the sheer, overwhelming impact sent Cheon Yura flying backward through the air with tremendous force, and she slammed violently into the nearest wall of the formation, blood erupting from her wounds upon impact. She crumpled and fell heavily to the floor in a heap, and the spot on the wall where she had struck with such force was left with a large, deep, undeniable indentation, a stark testament to the power of the blow she had absorbed. The new enemy spoke, his voice calm and analytical despite the violence of the exchange, observing coolly that a formidable young demon had indeed been steadily growing in strength and potential within the ranks of the heavenly, demonic divine cult. As he spoke, Cheon Yura remained on the cold floor, clearly injured and battered, but still alert and undeniably angry, her expression a clear and defiant challenge despite her weakened state. She pushed herself slowly, painfully up from the ground, supporting her weight first with her hands braced against the floor and then leaning heavily against the indented wall for stability, and glared fiercely, her eyes blazing with defiance, at the new enemy standing over her. The new enemy continued his assessment, revealing a crucial piece of information. Someone, somewhere, had issued a specific order to capture her alive, implying she held some particular value beyond simply being an enemy. However, he added grimly, his voice hardening, if he did not succeed in eliminating her completely this very day, there would undoubtedly be severe and negative consequences for him personally, suggesting his own fate was tied to hers. Hearing this new, unexpected piece of information, a weary, thoughtful look crossed Cheon Yura's face as she softly murmured to herself, almost unconscious about that person, a reference to an unknown individual whose influence seemed to extend even to this remote, trapped location. The new enemy strode slowly and deliberately towards Cheon Yura, his presence a palpable threat, telling her with a hint of something akin to admiration, perhaps even fear of her future potential, that in 20 years' time, given her rate of growth, he might well be forced to resort to using a deadly poison, a method of last resort, simply to get rid of her, implying her potential for immense, world-altering growth. Still on the floor, injured but defiant, Cheon Yura retorted, her voice strained but sharp, that his eyes appeared to be functioning quite correctly, suggesting he was indeed right about the trajectory of her future power and influence. The new enemy responded to her defiance with a wicked, predatory grin, saying that was precisely the undeniable reason why she would have to meet her end this very day, eliminating the future threat she represented. Surprisingly, despite her obvious injuries and weakened state, Cheon Yura began the arduous process of pushing herself up from the floor, leaning heavily upon her sword for much-needed support, using its blade as a crutch. She revealed, her voice steadying slightly despite her physical condition, that she had actually anticipated the distinct possibility of a complex mechanical formation being strategically set up in this specific location, a trap waiting to spring. More than that, she confessed, she had also considered the very real possibility of encountering a master-level opponent, an individual operating beyond her current capabilities towards the conclusion of her path here. Her body trembled slightly with the effort and from her injuries, but Cheon Yura braced herself firmly with her sword as she spoke, drawing strength from the familiar weight of her weapon. The new enemy slowly approached her, his voice laced with an almost unbearable condescension as he remarked on what he perceived as her pathetic, misplaced bravado, especially considering the fact that she claimed to have come here fully knowing and anticipating all that had transpired. Cheon Yura, however, remained steadfast, and then stated calmly that there had, in fact, been only one single thing she had been fundamentally mistaken about regarding the entire situation. The significant difference in opinions she held with a certain individual, someone she dismissively referred to as that bastard. Hearing this unexpected and jarring phrase, the new enemy was visibly surprised, his eyes narrowing in confusion as he processed her words. He repeated the phrase aloud, that bastard, his tone indicating a clear lack of awareness or recognition regarding the individual Cheon Yura was referring to, the name or title unfamiliar to him. At that very precise moment, Jin Yeomyung was standing silently and unobtrusively behind Cheon Yura, his presence undetected by the new enemy, his sword already drawn from its sheath, ready for action. Cheon Yura's expression shifted subtly, transitioning to one of quiet confidence, a small, knowing smile beginning to play upon her lips as she turned her head slightly and addressed Jin Yeomyung directly, asking him if her assessment, her final realization, was indeed correct. Jin Yeomyung confirmed her statement with a gentle nod, adding simply that he had indeed told her so, a quiet reminder of a previous conversation. In that brief exchange, it became abundantly clear that Jin Yeomyung had, at some earlier point, specifically warned Cheon Yura about the high likelihood of a complex formation trap being strategically set to capture her, anticipating such a move from their enemies. More than that, he had even specifically mentioned the chilling possibility of a powerful master-level opponent appearing as a final, significant enemy towards the end of such a planned confrontation. Thus, Cheon Yura had, in truth, been at least somewhat prepared, mentally if not physically, for the treacherous situation in which she now found herself, her foresight guided by Jin Yeomyung's wisdom. Jin Yeomyung wore a gentle, serene smile, exuding an aura of quiet confidence as he spoke to Cheon Yura, telling her that in the future, others would inevitably become far more wary and respectful of her inherent value as a person, her capabilities and potential, rather than simply focusing on her formal position as the young cult leader of the demonic sect. Holding the hilt of his sword comfortably in his left hand while supporting the gleaming blade with his right, a stance of poised readiness, Jin Yeomyung asked Cheon Yura directly about her recent experience fighting against a formidable new enemy, seeking her assessment of his power. Cheon Yura replied without hesitation that he was certainly a remarkably formidable opponent, explaining that his strength and skill demonstrated precisely why the 9 great sects were universally referred to and respected as powerful, prestigious forces in the martial world. Jin Yeomyung moved forward, positioning himself calmly alongside Cheon Yura, standing shoulder to shoulder with her in a gesture of solidarity and support, and remarked that she seemed quite confident in her assertion that he, the new enemy, was indeed from one of the esteemed 9 great sections. Cheon Yura then explained to Jin Yeomyung the basis for her deduction. His swordsmanship contained fundamental principles and techniques that were the exact, undeniable opposite of their own cult's unique methods, a stark contrast that allowed her to accurately deduce his origin from the established orthodox factions. Jin Yeomyung then offered a quiet but powerful reassurance, telling her simply not to worry any further now that he was personally present, implying his ability to handle the situation. Listening intently to the conversation unfolding between Jin Yeomyung and Cheon Yura, the new enemy stood rooted to the spot for a moment, appearing utterly dumbfounded by the turn of events and the casual familiarity between the two. The intense, dangerous gaze remained fixed in his eyes, a sign of his underlying power, but his previous air of effortless confidence still radiated from him as he simply listened to their exchange. He then addressed Jin Yeomyung directly, his voice sharper now, asking if he was perhaps referring to the Demon Heaven Jin clan, seemingly recognizing Jin Yeomyung, or at least the implications of his presence. The new enemy then began to move forward again, an unexpected glint of excitement in his eyes, exclaiming aloud about his incredible good fortune and labeling this unforeseen encounter as an unexpected and valuable gain, as he had certainly not anticipated meeting Jin Yeomyung in this remote location. He reiterated his initial objective, stressing once more that the young cult leader Cheon Yura absolutely must be killed. But before he could even finish articulating his thoughts or intentions regarding Jin Yeomyung, a small, glinting dagger was suddenly thrown with lightning speed towards him from an unseen direction. The new enemy was momentarily shocked, and unable to immediately process the suddenness and source of the attack. But he managed to avoid the swiftly thrown dagger at the absolute last moment by executing a lightning-fast duck of his head to the side, the blade whistling past his ear. He began to speak again, his voice filled with renewed surprise, asking if it could have been Jin Yeomyung who threw the weapon. But Jin Yeomyung calmly interrupted him, raising his hand in a simple gesture that commanded attention. Jin Yeomyung looked directly at the new enemy and asked if he had correctly referred to this elaborate trap as a mage pursuing killing formation. He then declared with calm authority to the new enemy that the formation, with all its intricate power, now rightfully belonged to him, Jin Yeomyung. He went on to explain, his voice clear and concise, the strategic reason behind his seemingly solitary arrival. All of his other available resources and forces were currently being strategically invested and deployed elsewhere on matters of critical importance. Hearing this statement, the new enemy was clearly surprised, his previous confidence perhaps beginning to waver slightly. He gripped his sword tightly, looking at Jin Yeomyung with an expression that, while intense, now contained a hint of something akin to an indifferent gaze, a struggle to categorize this unexpected development. Jin Yeomyung, however, in stark contrast to the new enemy's guarded reaction, appeared outwardly jubilant, practically sparkling with an infectious sense of bravado and self-assurance. With a decisive movement, he pointed his sword directly at the new enemy, its tip unwavering, and loudly challenged him, his voice ringing out with undeniable confidence, asking if the new enemy truly planned to attempt to turn the very heavens upside down in his pursuit of his goals, a hyperbolic challenge to the formidable master before him. That's all, folks. If you enjoyed the twists, turns, and epic power-ups, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss another legendary recap.